Tonight, uncover the ancient secrets of how power truly shaped Egypt, revealing the pharaoh's intricate political world. Get ready to drift into a relaxing, insightful journey through history. But what if the very structure designed to unite a kingdom also held the seeds of its greatest vulnerabilities? We're diving deep into the political constitution of ancient Egypt, far beyond just kings and pyramids. This isn't just history. It's a gentle, immersive exploration designed for ultimate relaxation and focus, blending scholarly insight with calming visuals. You'll hear directly from the timeless work of renowned Egyptologist Gaston Maspero, discovering the surprising complexities behind a civilization that endured for millennia. How did this ancient political machine manage such stability, yet occasionally descend into chaos? Join us for a unique experience, perfect for sleep or study, where every detail is tuned for your comfort and enlightenment. Like, comment, and subscribe to Luminous Antiquity for more journeys into the past.
History of Egypt, Chaldæa, Syria, Babylonia, and Assyria, Volume 2, Chapter 1. The Political Constitution of Egypt. Between the Fayum and the delta's northern point, the Libyan mountain range spreads out, forming a vast, slightly undulating plateau. This tableland runs parallel to the Nile for nearly 30 leagues. At its northern edge, the great sphinx, Harmachis, has stood guard ever since the time of the followers of Horus. Carved directly from the solid rock at the mountain plateau's farthest margin, he appears to raise his head, as if to be the first to witness his father, the sun, rise across the valley. Now only the general outline of the lion can be traced in his weather-worn body. The lower part of his headdress has fallen, making his neck seem too slender to support the weight of the head. Fanatical Mamluk cannon shot has damaged both his nose and beard, and the vibrant red coloring that once enlivened his features has almost entirely vanished. Despite this decay, he still bears a commanding expression of strength and dignity. His eyes gaze into the far distance with intense, deep thought. His lips still smile, and his entire face exudes calmness and power. The art that could conceive and carve this gigantic statue from the mountainside was art in its maturity, master of itself, and confident in its effects. How many centuries were needed to bring it to such a degree of development and perfection? In later times, a chapel of alabaster and rose granite was built alongside the god. Temples rose here and there in the more accessible spots, and around them clustered the tombs of the entire region. The common people's bodies, usually naked and uncoffined, are simply thrust under the sand, barely 3 feet from the surface. Those of a better class rested in modest rectangular chambers, hastily constructed of yellow bricks and roofed with pointed vaulting. No ornaments or treasures gladdened the deceased in these miserable resting places. However, a few coarse pottery vessels contained provisions meant to nourish them during their second existence. Some of the richest had their tombs carved directly into the mountainside, but the majority preferred an isolated tomb, a mastaba, comprising an above-ground chapel, a vertical shaft, and subterranean vaults. From a distance, these chapels resemble truncated pyramids, varying in size according to the owner's fortune or taste. Some measure 30 to 40 feet in height, with a facade 160 feet long and a depth of about 80 feet. Others reach only 10 feet in height upon a 16-foot square base. The walls slope uniformly inward and usually have a smooth surface. Sometimes, however, their courses are set back one above the other, almost like steps. Brick mastabas were carefully cemented externally, and their internal layers were bound together by fine sand poured into the spaces. Stone mastabas, conversely, show regularity only in the decoration of their outer facings. In 9 out of 10 cases, the core is built of rough stone blocks, crudely cut into squares, cemented with gravel and dried mud, or simply thrown together haphazardly without any mortar. The entire building should have been oriented according to rule, the 4 sides facing the 4 cardinal points, with the longest axis running north and south, but the masons seldom bothered to find true north, so the orientation is usually incorrect. The doors face east, sometimes north or south, but never west. One of these is merely the semblance of a door. A high, narrow niche positioned to face east and decorated with grooves framing a carefully walled-up entrance. This was for the use of the dead, as it was believed the ghost entered or left it at will. The door for the living, sometimes preceded by a portico, was usually characterized by great simplicity. Above it, a cylindrical tympanum or a smooth flagstone bore sometimes just the dead person's name, sometimes their titles and lineage, sometimes a prayer for their well-being and an enumeration of the days they were entitled to receive ancestral worship. On their behalf, and almost always in the exact same words, they invoked the great god, the Osiris of Mendes, or Anubis dwelling in the divine palace. They prayed that burial might be granted to them in Amentate, the land of the west, the very great and very good, to them the vassal of the great god, that they might walk in the ways in which it is good to walk, they, the vassal of the great god, that they might have offerings of bread, cakes, and drink at the New Year's feast, at the feast of Thoth, on the first day of the year, at the feast of Uagite, at the great fire festival, at the procession of the god Minu, at the feast of offerings, at the monthly and half-monthly festivals, and every single day. The chapel itself is usually small, almost lost within the building's vastness. It generally consists merely of an oblong chamber, approached by a rather short passage. At the far end, recessed into the western wall, stands a huge quadrilateral stela. At its foot, an offering table of alabaster, granite, or limestone lies flat on the ground. Sometimes 2 small obelisks or 2 altars, hollowed at the top, are also present to receive the gifts mentioned in the exterior inscription. The overall appearance is that of a rather low, narrow doorway, too small to be a practical entrance. This recess is almost always left empty. Sometimes, however, the piety of relatives placed a statue of the deceased within it. Standing there, with shoulders thrown back, head erect and smiling, the statue seems to step forth to lead the double from its dark, embalmed lodging to those vibrant plains where it once lived freely during earthly life. In another moment, crossing the threshold, it would descend a few steps into the public hall. On festivals and offering days, when the priest and family presented the banquet with customary rites, this great painted figure, in the act of advancing, and seen by the light of flickering torches or smoking lamps, might very well appear embodied with life, as if the dead ancestor himself stepped out of the wall and mysteriously stood before his descendants to claim their homage. The inscription on the lintel repeated once more the name and rank of the dead. Faithful portraits of him and other family members appeared in the bas-reliefs on the doorposts. The little scene at the far end depicts him seated tranquilly at table, with the details of the feast carefully recorded at his side. This starts from the moment water is brought for his ablution to the point when, all culinary skill exhausted, he need only return to his dwelling in a state of beatified satisfaction. The stela represented to the visitor the door leading to the dead's private apartments. Its permanent sealing showed that no living mortal might cross its threshold. The inscription covering its surface was more than just a mere epitaph informing future generations of who lay beneath. The nameless dead, like a living man without a name, was considered non-existent. Nor was this the stele's only use. The pictures and prayers inscribed upon it acted as talismans, ensuring the continuous existence of the ancestor whose memory they recalled. They compelled the invoked god, whether Osiris or the jackal Anubis, to act as mediator between the living and the departed. They granted the god the enjoyment of sacrifices and the abundant good things offered to deities by which they live, on condition that a share of them first be set aside for the deceased. Through divine favor, the soul, or rather the doubles, of the bread, meat, and beverages passed into the other world to refresh the human double. It wasn't even necessary for the offering to have a material existence to be effective. The first person to repeat aloud the name and formulas inscribed on the stone secured for the unknown occupant, by this means alone, the immediate possession of all the things enumerated. The stele constitutes the essential part of the chapel and tomb. In many cases, it was the only inscribed portion, being alone necessary to ensure the dead man's identity and continuous existence. Often, however, the sides of the chamber and passage were not left bare. When time or the owner's wealth permitted, they were covered with scenes and writing, expressing at greater length the ideas summarized by the figures and inscriptions of the stele. Neither pictorial effect nor the whim of the moment was allowed to guide the artist in choosing subjects. Everything he drew, pictures or words, had a magical purpose. Every individual who built an eternal house either assigned it a staff of priests for the double, inspectors, scribes, and slaves, or made an agreement with a neighboring temple's priest to serve the chapel in perpetuity. Lands taken from his patrimony, which thus became the domains of the eternal house, rewarded them for their efforts and supplied them with meats, vegetables, fruits, liquors, linen, and vessels for sacrifice. In theory, these liturgies were to be perpetuated year after year until the end of time, but in practice, after 3 or 4 generations, older ancestors were forsaken for those who had died more recently. Despite the donor's imprecations and threats against priests who neglected their duty or against those who usurped the funeral endowments, sooner or later, a time came when, forsaken by all, the double was in danger of perishing for want of sustenance. To ensure that the promised gifts, offered in substance on the day of burial, would be maintained throughout the centuries, relatives not only depicted them upon the chapel walls, but also represented the lands which produced them and the labor that contributed to their production. On one side, we see plowing, sowing, reaping, carrying corn, storing grain, fattening poultry, and driving cattle. A little further on, workmen of all descriptions are engaged in their trades. Shoemakers ply the awl, glassmakers blow through their tubes, metal founders watch over their smelting pots, carpenters hew down trees and build a ship. Groups of women weave or spin under the eye of a frowning taskmaster who seems impatient with their chatter. Did the double in his hunger desire meat? He might choose from the pictures on the wall the animal that pleased him best, whether kid, ox, or gazelle. He might follow its life's course from its birth in the meadows to the slaughterhouse and kitchen, and satisfy his hunger with its flesh. The double saw himself represented in the paintings as hunting, and to the hunt he went. He was painted eating and drinking with his wife, and he ate and drank with her. The pictured plowing, harvesting, and gathering into barns thus became actual realities for him. In essence, this painted world of men and things represented on the wall was quickened by the same life that animated the double, upon whom it all depended. The picture of a meal or a slave was perhaps what best suited the shade of the guest or master. Even today, when we enter one of these decorated chapels, the idea of death scarcely comes to mind. We have, rather, the impression of being in some old-world house to which the master might return at any moment. We see him portrayed everywhere on the walls, followed by his servants, and surrounded by everything that made his earthly life enjoyable. One or two statues of him stand at the end of the room, constantly ready to undergo the opening of the mouth ritual and to receive offerings. Should these be accidentally removed, others, secretly placed in a small chamber hidden within the masonry, are there to replace them. These inner chambers rarely have any external outlet, though occasionally they connect with the chapel by a small opening, so narrow it hardly admits a hand. Those who came to repeat prayers and burn incense at this aperture were received by the dead in person. The statues were not mere images, devoid of consciousness, just as a god's double could be linked to an idol in the temple's sanctuary to transform it into a prophetic being capable of speech and movement. So too, when a man's double was attached to the effigy of his earthly body, whether in stone, metal, or wood, a real, living person was created and introduced into the tomb. So strong was this conviction that the belief has lived on through two changes of religion until the present day. The double still haunts the statues with which he was associated in the past. As in former times, he still strikes with madness or death anyone who dares to disturb his rest, and one can only be protected from him by breaking, at the moment of discovery, the perfect statues the vault contains. The double is weakened or killed by the mutilation of these his sustainers. The statues offer a more accurate idea of the deceased than his mummy, which was disfigured by the embalmer's work. They were also less easily destroyed, and any number could be made at will. Hence arose the truly incredible number of statues sometimes hidden away in the same tomb. These sustainers, or imperishable bodies of the double, were multiplied to ensure a practical immortality. The care with which they were shut into a secure hiding place increased their chances of preservation. All the same, no precaution was neglected that could save a mummy from destruction. The shaft leading to it descended to an average depth of 40 to 50 feet, but sometimes it reached and even exceeded 100 feet. Running horizontally from it is a passage so low as to prevent a man standing upright, which leads to the proper sepulchral chamber. This chamber, hewn from the solid rock, is devoid of all ornament. The sarcophagus, whether from fine limestone, rose granite, or black basalt, does not always bear the deceased's name and titles. The servants who deposited the body placed beside it, on the dusty floor, the quarters of an ox previously slaughtered in the chapel, as well as vials of perfume and large vases of red pottery containing muddy water. After this, they walled up the entrance of the passage and filled the shaft with stone chips intermingled with earth and gravel. The whole, being well watered, soon hardened into a compact mass, which protected the vault and its master from desecration.
Over the centuries, the ever-increasing number of tombs eventually formed an almost uninterrupted chain of burying places on the plateau. At Giza, they follow a symmetrical plan, lining the sides of regular roads. At Saqqara, they are scattered across the ground, in some places sparsely, in others huddled confusingly together. Everywhere, the tombs are rich in inscriptions, statues, and painted or sculptured scenes, each revealing some characteristic custom or detail of contemporary civilization. From the very womb of these cemeteries, as it were, the Egypt of the Memphite dynasties gradually takes new life and reappears in the full daylight of history. Nobles and fellahs, soldiers and priests, scribes and craftsmen, the whole nation lives anew before us, each with their manners, their dress, their daily round of occupations and pleasures. It is a perfect picture, and although in places the drawing is defaced and the color dimmed, these may be restored with no great difficulty and with almost absolute certainty. The pharaoh stands out boldly in the foreground, his tall figure towering over all else. He so completely transcends his surroundings that at first sight one might well ask if he represents a god rather than a man. And, as a matter of fact, he is a god to his subjects. They call him the good god, the great god, and connect him with Ra through intervening kings, the successors of the gods who ruled the two worlds. His father before him was son of Ra, as was his grandfather and his great-grandfather, and so through all his ancestors until from son of Ra to son of Ra they at last reached Ra himself. Sometimes an adventurer of unknown antecedents is abruptly inserted into this series, and we might imagine that he would interrupt the succession of the solar line. But on closer examination, we always find that either the intruder is connected with the god by a hitherto unsuspected genealogy, or that he is even more closely related to him than his predecessors, inasmuch as Ra, having secretly descended upon the earth, had begotten him by a mortal mother to rejuvenate the race. If things came to the worst, a marriage with some princess would soon legitimize, if not the usurper himself, at least his descendants, and thus firmly re-establish the succession. The pharaohs, therefore, are blood relations of the sun god, some through their father, others through their mother, directly begotten by the god. Their souls, as well as their bodies, have a supernatural origin. Each soul is a double detached from Horus, the successor of Osiris, and the first to reign alone over Egypt. This divine double is infused into the royal infant at birth in the same manner as the ordinary double is incarnate in common mortals. It always remained concealed and seemed to lie dormant in those princes whom destiny did not call upon to reign. But it awaked to full self-consciousness in those who ascended the throne at the moment of their accession. From that time until their death and beyond it, all that they possessed of ordinary humanity was completely effaced. They were from henceforth only the sons of Ra, the Horus dwelling upon earth, who, during his sojourn here below, renews the blessings of Horus, son of Isis. Their complex nature was revealed at the outset in the form and arrangement of their names. Among the Egyptians, the choice of a name was not a matter of indifference. Not only did men and beasts, but even inanimate objects require one or more names. It may be said that no person or thing in the world could attain complete existence until the name had been conferred. The most ancient names were often just a short word, denoting some moral or physical quality, such as Titi the runner, Mini the lasting, Quenkini the crusher, Sondi the formidable, or Uznazit the flowery-tongued. They also consisted of short sentences, by which the royal child confessed his faith in the god's power and his participation in the sun's life acts. Khafre, his rising is Ra. Menkauhuru, the doubles of Horus last forever. Usiakeri, the double of Ra is omnipotent. Sometimes the sentence is shortened and the god's name is understood. For instance, Usir-Kaf, his double is omnipotent. Snofmi, he has made me good. Kufwi, he has protected me, are abbreviations for the names Usir-Keri, Ptas Nafrui, Kanum Kufui, with the suppression of Ra, Ptah, and Kanum. Once the name had, as it were, taken possession of a man on his entrance into life, it never left him, either in this world or the next. The prince who had been called Unas or Asi at the moment of his birth retained this name even after death, so long as his mummy existed and his double was not annihilated. When the Egyptians wished to denote that a person or thing was in a certain place, they inserted their names within the picture of that place. Thus, the name of Teti is written inside a picture of Teti's castle, resulting in a compound hieroglyph. Again, when a king's son became king, they enclosed his ordinary name in a long, flat-bottomed frame, which we call a cartouche. The elliptical part of this cartouche is a kind of plan of the world, a representation of those regions traversed by Ra in his journey, and over which Pharaoh, as a son of Ra, exercised his rule. This appears when the names of Teti or Snofru follow the group that expresses sovereignty over the two halves of Egypt, the south and the north. The whole expression precisely describes the visible person of Pharaoh during his time among mortals. But this first name, chosen for the child, did not encompass the whole man. It left without appropriate designation the double of Horus, which was revealed to the prince at the moment of his accession. The double, therefore, received a special title, always constructed on a uniform plan. First, the picture of the hawk god, who desired to leave to his descendants a portion of his soul. Then, a simple or compound epithet specifying the virtue of Horus the pharaoh wished particularly to possess. Horu Nibma'af, Horus, master of truth. Horu Miritui, Horus, friend of both lands. Horu Nib-Ha'u, Horus, master of the risings. Horu Maziati, Horus who crushes his enemies. The variable part of these terms is usually written in an oblong rectangle terminated at the lower end by lines summarily portraying a monument's facade. In the center, a bolted door may sometimes be distinguished. This represents the chapel where the double will one day rest, and the closed door is the portal of the tomb. The stereotyped part of the names and titles represented by the figure of the god is placed outside the rectangle, sometimes beside it, sometimes upon its top. The hack is, in fact, free by nature, and could nowhere remain imprisoned against his will. This artless preamble was not enough to satisfy the love of precision, which is an essential characteristic of the Egyptians. When they wished to represent the double in his sepulchral chamber, they left out of consideration the period in his existence during which he had presided over the sovereign's earthly destinies, to make them similar to those of Horus from whom the double proceeded. They therefore withdrew him from the tomb that should have been his lot. In its place, they substituted for the ordinary sparrowhawk one of those groups symbolizing sovereignty over the two countries of the Nile, the coiled uraeus of the north and the vulture of the south. Finally, a second sparrowhawk was added, the golden sparrowhawk, the triumphant sparrowhawk that had delivered Egypt from Typhon. The soul of Snowfru, called as a surviving double Horus, Master of Truth, is, as a living double, entitled the Lord of the Vulture and the Uraeus, Master of Truth, and Horus Triumphant.
On the other hand, the royal prince, when he donned the diadem, received, from the moment of his advancement to the highest rank, such an increase of dignity that his birth name, even when framed in a cartouche and enhanced with brilliant epithets, was no longer able to fully represent him. This exaltation of his person was therefore marked by a new designation. As he was the living flesh of the sun, his surname always alluded to some point in his relations with his father. It proclaimed the love he felt for the latter, Miriri, or that the latter experienced for him, Miririri. Or else it indicated the stability of Ra's doubles, Tatkare, their goodness, Nofirkare, or some other of their sovereign virtues. Several pharaohs of the fourth dynasty had already dignified themselves with these surnames. Those of the sixth dynasty were the first to incorporate them regularly into the royal preamble. There was some hesitation at first regarding the surname's position. It was sometimes placed after the birth name, as in Papi Nofirkare, and sometimes before it, as in Nofirkare Papi. It was finally decided to place it at the beginning, preceded by the group King of Upper and Lower Egypt, which expresses in its fullest extent the power granted by the gods to the pharaoh alone. The other, or birth name, came after it, accompanied by the words Son of the Sun. Inscribed either before or above these two solar names, which are exclusively applied to the visible and living body of the master, were the two names of the sparrow hawk belonging especially to the soul. First that of the double in the tomb, and then that of the double while still incarnate. 4 terms thus seemed necessary to the Egyptians to accurately define the pharaoh both in time and in eternity. Long centuries were needed before this subtle analysis of the royal person and the learned graduation of the formulas that corresponded to it could transform the nome chief, become by conquest suzerain over all other chiefs and king of all Egypt, into a living god here below, the all-powerful son and successor of the gods. But the divine concept of royalty, once implanted in the mind, quickly produced its inevitable consequences. From the moment that the pharaoh became god upon earth, the gods of heaven, his fathers or his brothers, and the goddesses recognized him as their son, and according to the ceremonial imposed by custom in such cases, they consecrated his adoption by offering him the breast to suck, as they would have done to their own child. Ordinary mortals spoke of him only in symbolic words, designating him by some circumlocution: Pharaoh, Pirui Awe, the double palace, Peruete, the sublime port, his majesty, the son of the two lands, Horus, master of the palace, or less ceremoniously, by the indeterminate pronoun one. The greater number of these terms are always accompanied by a wish addressed to the sovereign for his life, health, and strength, the initial signs of which are written after all his titles. He accepts all this graciously, and even on his own initiative swears by his own life or by the favor of Ra, but he forbids his subjects to imitate him. For them it is a sin punishable in this world and the next to swear by the sovereign's person, except when a magistrate requires a judicial oath. He is approached, moreover, as a god is approached, with downcast eyes and head or back bent. They sniff the earth before him. They veil their faces with both hands to shut out the splendor of his appearance. They chant a devout form of adoration before submitting a petition. No one is free from this obligation. His ministers themselves and the great ones of his kingdom cannot deliberate with him on matters of state without inaugurating the proceeding with a sort of solemn service in his honor and reciting to him at length a eulogy of his divinity. They did not indeed explicitly exalt him above the other gods, but these were rather too many to share heaven among them, while he alone ruled over the entire circuit of the sun, and the whole earth, its mountains and plains, was in subjection under his sandaled feet. People no doubt might be met with those who did not obey him, but these were rebels, adherents of Set, children of Un, who, sooner or later, would be overtaken by punishment. While hoping that his fictitious claim to universal dominion would be realized, the king adopted, in addition to the simple costume of the old chiefs, the long or short petticoat, the jackal's tail, the turned-up sandals, and the insignia of the supreme gods, the ankh, the crook, the flail, and the scepter tipped with the head of a jerboa, or a hare, which we misname the kukufa-headed scepter. He put on the multicolored diadems of the gods, the headdresses covered with feathers, the white and the red crowns, either separately or combined to form the spent. The viper or uraeus in metal or golded wood, which rose from his forehead, was imbued with a mysterious life, making it a means of executing his vengeance and accomplishing his secret purposes. It was supposed to vomit flames and destroy those who dared to attack its master in battle. The supernatural virtues it communicated to the crown made it an enchanted thing that no one could resist. Lastly, Pharaoh had his temples, where his enthroned statue, animated by one of his doubles, received worship, prophesied, and fulfilled all the functions of a divine being both during his life and after he had rejoined in the tomb his ancestors of the gods who existed before him and who now reposed impassively within the depths of their pyramids. Man, as far as his body was concerned, and God in virtue of his soul and its attributes, the pharaoh by right of this dual nature acted as a constant mediator between heaven and earth. He alone was fit to transmit the prayers of men to his fathers and his brethren, the gods, just as the head of a family was in his household the priest par excellence of that family's gods, just as the chief of a nome was in his nome the priest par excellence in regard to the gods of the nome, so was Pharaoh the priest par excellence of all the gods of Egypt, who were his special deities.
He accompanied their images in solemn processions. He poured out before them the wine and mystic milk, recited the formulas in their hearing, seized the bull which was the victim by a lasso, and slaughtered it according to the rite consecrated by ancient tradition. Private individuals had recourse to his intercession when they asked some favor from on high. However, as it was impossible for every sacrifice to pass actually through his hands, the priest celebrating each ceremony proclaimed at the beginning of the ceremony that it was the king who was making the offering, Suti di Abhatbul, he and none other, to Osiris, Ptah, and Ka-Harmakis, so that they might grant to the faithful who implored them the object of their desires. The declaration being accepted in lieu of the act, the king was thus regarded as really officiating on every occasion for his subjects. He thus maintained daily intercourse with the gods, and they, for their part, did not neglect any occasion to communicate with him. They appeared to him in dreams to foretell his future, to command him to restore a monument threatened in ruin, to advise him to set out to war, or to forbid him risking his life in the thick of the fight.
Communication by prophetic dreams was not, however, the method usually selected by the gods. They employed priests and temple statues as interpreters of their wishes. The king would enter the chapel where the statue was kept, perform the invocatory rites in its presence, and question it on the subject occupying his mind. The priest replied under direct inspiration from on high, and the dialogue thus begun might last a long time. Interminable discourses, whose records cover the walls of the Theban temples, inform us what the pharaoh said on such occasions, and in what emphatic tones the gods replied. Sometimes the animated statues raised their voices in the darkness of the sanctuary and themselves announced their will. More frequently, they were content to indicate it by a gesture. When consulted on a particular subject and they returned no sign, it was their way of signifying their disapprobation. If, on the other hand, they significantly bowed their head once or twice, the subject was an acceptable one, and they approved it. No state affair was settled without asking their advice, and without their giving it in one way or another. The monuments, which shed full light on the supernatural character of the pharaohs in general, tell us little of the individual disposition of any particular king or of their everyday life. When by chance we come into closer intimacy for a moment with the sovereign, he is revealed to us as being less divine and majestic than we might have been led to believe had we judged him only by his impassive expression and the pomp with which he was surrounded in public. Not that he ever quite laid aside his grandeur. Even in his home life, in his chamber or his garden, during those hours when he felt himself withdrawn from public gaze, those highest in rank might never forget, when they approached him, that he was a god. He showed himself to be a kind father, a good-natured husband, ready to dally with his wives and caress them on the cheek as they offered him a flower or moved a piece upon the draught-board. He took an interest in those who waited on him, allowed them certain breaches of etiquette when he was pleased with them, and was indulgent to their little failings. If they had just returned from foreign lands, a little countrified after a lengthy exile from court, he would break out into pleasantries over their embarrassment and their unfashionable costume, kingly pleasantries that excited the forced mirth of the bystanders, but which soon fell flat and had no meaning for those outside the palace. The pharaoh was fond of laughing and drinking. Indeed, if we may believe evil Kongs, he sometimes took so much as to incapacitate him for business. The chase was not always a pleasure to him, hunting in the desert at least, where the lions evinced a provoking tendency to show as little respect for the prince's divinity as for his mortal subjects. But like the chiefs of old, he felt it a duty to his people to destroy wild beasts, and he ended by counting the slain in hundreds, however short his reign might be. A considerable part of his time was taken up in war. in the east against the Libyans in the regions of the Oasis, in the Nile Valley south of Aswan against the Nubians, on the Isthmus of Suez and in the Sinaitic Peninsula against the Bedouin, frequently also in civil war against some ambitious noble or some turbulent member of his own family. He traveled frequently from south to north and from north to south, leaving in every possible place marked traces of his visits, on the rocks of Elephantine and of the First Cataract, on those of Silsilis or of El Kab. He appeared to his vassals as Tum himself arose among them to repress injustice and disorder. He restored or enlarged monuments, regulated equitably the assessment of taxes and charges, settled or dismissed lawsuits between one town and another concerning the appropriation of water or the possession of certain territories, distributed vacant fiefs among his faithful servants, and granted pensions to be paid out of the royal revenues. At length, he re-entered Memphis or one of his usual residences, where fresh laborers awaited him. He gave an audience daily to all, whether high or low, who were, or believed they were, wronged by some official, and who came to appeal to the master's justice against the injustice of his servant. If he left the palace after the cause had been heard, to take a boat or to go to the temple, he was not left undisturbed. Petitions and supplications assailed him by the way. In addition to this, there were the daily sacrifices, the dispatch of current affairs, the ceremonies that demanded the pharaoh's presence, and the reception of nobles or foreign envoys. One would think that in the midst of so many occupations he would never feel time hang heavy on his hands. He was, however, a prey to that profound ennui which most Oriental monarchs feel so keenly, and which neither the cares nor the pleasures of ordinary life could dispel. Like the sultans of the Arabian Nights, the pharaohs were accustomed to having marvelous tales related to them, or they assembled their counselors to ask them to suggest some fresh amusement. A happy thought would sometimes strike one of them, as in the case of him who aroused Snufru's interest by recommending him to have his boat manned by young girls barely clad in a large meshed network. All his pastimes were not so playful. The Egyptians by nature were not cruel, and we have very few records in history or in tradition of bloodthirsty pharaohs. But the life of an ordinary individual was of so little value in their eyes that they never hesitated to sacrifice it, even for a caprice. A sorcerer had no sooner boasted before Cheops of being able to raise the dead than the king proposed he try the experiment on a prisoner whose head was to be forthwith cut off. The anger of Pharaoh was quickly excited, and once aroused it became a consuming fire. The Egyptians were wont to describe its intensity. His majesty became as furious as a panther. The wild beast often revealed itself in the half-civilized man. The pharaoh's family was very numerous. The women were principally chosen from the relatives of high-ranking court officials, or from the daughters of great feudal lords. There were, however, many strangers among them, daughters or sisters of petty Libyan, Nubian, or Asiatic kings. They were brought into Pharaoh's house as hostages for their respective people's submission. They did not all enjoy the same treatment or consideration, and their original position decided their status in the harem, unless the amorous caprice of their master should otherwise decide. Most of them remained merely concubines for life. Others were raised to the rank of royal spouses, and at least one received the title and privileges of great spouse or queen. This was rarely accorded to a stranger, but almost always to a princess born in the purple, a daughter of Ra, if possible, a sister of the pharaoh, who inherited in the same degree and in equal proportion the flesh and blood of the sun god, had more than others the right to share the bed and throne of her brother. She had her own house, and a train of servants and followers as large as those of the king.
While the women of inferior rank were more or less shut up in the parts of the palace assigned to them, she came and went at pleasure, and appeared in public with or without her husband. The preamble of official documents in which she is mentioned solemnly recognizes her as the living follower of Horus, the associate of the Lord of the Vulture and the Uraeus, the very gentle, the very praiseworthy, she who sees her Horus or Horus and Set face to face. Her union with the god-king rendered her a goddess and entailed upon her the fulfillment of all the duties that a god owed to a god. These were varied and important.
The woman, indeed, was supposed to combine in herself more completely than a man the qualities necessary for the exercise of magic, whether legitimate or otherwise. She saw and heard that which the eyes and ears of man could not perceive. Her voice, being more flexible and piercing, was heard at greater distances. She was by nature mistress of the art of summoning or banishing invisible beings. While Pharaoh was engaged in sacrificing, the queen, by her incantations, protected him from malignant deities, whose interest it was to divert the celebrant's attention from holy things. She put them to flight by the sound of prayer and sistrum. She poured libations and offered perfumes and flowers. In processions, she walked behind her husband, gave audience with him, and governed for him while he was engaged in foreign wars or during his progresses through his kingdom. Such was the work of Isis while her brother Osiris was conquering the world. Widowhood did not always entirely disqualify her. If she belonged to the solar race and the new sovereign was a minor, she acted as regent by hereditary right and retained the authority for some years longer. It occasionally happened that a queen had no children, or that the child of another woman inherited the crown. In such a case, there was no law or custom to prevent a young and beautiful widow from marrying the son of her deceased husband, and thus regaining her rank as queen. It was in this manner that, during the earlier part of the Fourth Dynasty, Princess Mertetefsi successfully ingratiated herself in the favor of Snufrui and Cheops. Such a situation didn't often arise, and a queen who had once left the throne had little chance of ascending it again. Her titles, her duties, her supremacy over the rest of the family all passed to a younger rival. Formerly, she had been the king's active companion. Now, she became only the nominal spouse of the god, and her office ended when the god, of whom she had been the goddess, left his body and departed heavenward to rejoin his father the sun on the far distant horizon. Children swarmed in the palace, just as they did in the houses of private citizens. In spite of the many who died in infancy, they were reckoned by the tens, sometimes by the 100, and more than one pharaoh must have been puzzled to remember the exact number and names of his offspring. The origin and rank of their mothers greatly influenced the children's status. No doubt the divine blood they inherited from a common father raised them all above the common people, but those connected with the solar line on their mother's side occupied a decidedly higher position than the rest. As long as one of these was living, none of his less nobly born brothers might aspire to the crown. Those princesses who did not become queen by marriage were given in early youth to some well-to-do relative or to some high-born courtier whom Pharaoh wished to honor. They served as priestesses to the goddesses Neat or Hathor and held titles within their households that they transmitted to their children along with whatever right to the crown belonged to them. The most favored princes married heiresses, rich in estates, settled on their domains, and founded a line of feudal lords. Most of the royal sons remained at court, first in their father's service and subsequently in that of their brothers or nephews. The most difficult and best compensated administrative roles were assigned to them: the superintendents of public works, important priestly offices, and command of the army. It could have been no easy matter to manage without friction this multitude of relations and connections, past and present queens, sisters, concubines, uncles, brothers, cousins, nephews, sons, and grandsons of kings who crowded the harem and the palace. The women contended among themselves for the master's affection, either for themselves or their children. The children were jealous of one another, often united only by a common hatred for the son whom the chances of birth had destined to be their ruler. As long as he was vigorous and energetic, Pharaoh maintained order in his family. But as his advancing years and failing strength signaled an approaching change in the succession, competition became more open and intrigue thickened around him or his nearest heirs. Sometimes, indeed, he took precautions to prevent an outbreak and its disastrous consequences by solemnly associating the chosen son with himself in royal power. Egypt, in this case, had to obey two masters. The younger attended to the more active duties of royalty, such as progressing through the country, military expeditions, hunting wild beasts, and administering justice. The elder preferred to confine himself to the role of advisor or benevolent counselor. Even this precaution, however, was insufficient to prevent disasters. The women of the seraglio, encouraged by their relations or friends, secretly plotted for the removal of the irksome sovereign. The princes who had been deprived of any legitimate hope of reigning by their father's decision concealed their discontent to no purpose. They were arrested on the first suspicion of disloyalty and massacred wholesale. Their only chance of escaping summary execution was either by rebellion or by taking refuge with some independent tribe in Libya or the Sinai Desert. We can conclude that if we knew the details of Egypt's internal history, it would appear as stormy and bloody as other Oriental empires. Harem intrigues, palace conspiracies, murders of heir apparent, divisions and rebellions in the royal family were the almost inevitable accompaniment of every accession to the Egyptian throne. The earliest dynasties originated in the White Wall, but the pharaohs hardly ever made this town their residence, and it would be incorrect to say they considered it their capital. Each king chose for himself in the Memphite or Leptolite nome between the entrance of the Fayum and the apex of the delta a special residence. There he dwelt with his court, and from there he governed Egypt. Such a multitude to form his court needed not an ordinary palace, but an entire city. A brick wall surmounted with battlements formed a square or rectangular enclosure around it of sufficient thickness and height not only to defy a popular insurrection or the surprises of marauding Bedouins, but to resist for a long time a regular siege. At the extreme end of one of its facades, a single tall and narrow opening, closed by a wooden door supported on bronze hinges and surmounted with a row of pointed metal ornaments, led into a long, narrow passage between the external wall and an equally strong partition wall. At the end of the passage, in the angle, was a second door, sometimes leading into a second passage, but more often opening into a large courtyard where the dwelling houses were somewhat crowded together. Assailants ran the risk of being annihilated in the passage before reaching the center of the place. The royal residence could be immediately distinguished by the projecting balconies on its facade. From these, as from a tribune, Pharaoh could watch the evolutions of his guard, the stately approach of foreign envoys, Egyptian nobles seeking audience, or officials he desired to reward for their services. They advanced from the far end of the court, stopped before the balcony, and after prostrating themselves, stood up, bowed their heads, wrung and twisted their hands, now quickly, now slowly, in a rhythmic manner, rendering worship to their master, chanting his praises. Then they received the necklaces and jewelry of gold he presented to them by his chamberlains, or which he himself deigned to throw to them. It is difficult for us to glimpse the details of the internal arrangements. We find, however, mention made of large halls, resembling the hall of the tomb in the heavens, where the king repaired to deal with state affairs in council, to dispense justice, and sometimes also to preside at state banquets. Long rows of tall columns, carved from rare woods and painted with bright colors, supported the roofs of these chambers, which were entered by doors inlaid with gold and silver and encrusted with malachite or lapis lazuli.
The private apartments, the akonuti, were entirely separate, but they communicated with the queen's dwelling and with the harem of the wives of inferior rank. The royal children occupied a quarter to themselves, under the care of their tutors. They had their own houses and a train of servants proportionate to their rank, age, and the fortune of their mother's family. The nobles who had appointments at court and the royal domestics lived in the palace itself, but the offices of the different functionaries, the storehouses for their provisions, and the dwellings of their employees formed distinct quarters outside the palace, grouped around narrow courts and communicating with each other by a labyrinth of lanes or covered passages. The entire building was constructed of wood or bricks, less frequently of roughly dressed stone, often poorly built and lacking in solidity. The ancient pharaohs were no more inclined than the sultans of later days to occupy palaces where their predecessors had lived and died. Each king desired a habitation after his own heart, one that would not be haunted by the memory or perhaps the double of another sovereign. These royal mansions, hastily erected and hastily filled with occupants, were vacated and fell into ruin with no less rapidity. They grew old with their master or even more rapidly than he, and his disappearance almost always entailed their ruin. In the neighborhood of Memphis, many such palaces might be seen which their short-lived masters had built for eternity, an eternity that lasted no longer than the lives of their builders. Nothing could present greater variety than the population of these ephemeral cities at the climax of their splendor. We have first the people who immediately surrounded the pharaoh, the retainers of the palace and of the harem, whose highly complex degrees of rank are revealed to us on the monuments. His person was, as it were, minutely subdivided into departments, each requiring its attendants and their appointed chiefs. His toilet alone gave employment to a score of different trades. There were royal barbers who had the privilege of shaving his head and chin, hairdressers who made, curled, and put on his black or blue wigs and adjusted the diadems to them. There were manicurists who pared and polished his nails, perfumers who prepared the scented oils and pomades for anointing his body, the kohl for blackening his eyelids, and the rouge for spreading on his lips and cheeks. His wardrobe required a whole troop of shoemakers, belt-makers, and tailors. Some cared for fabrics in the piece. Others presided over body linen, while others took charge of his garments, comprising long or short, transparent or thick petticoats, fitting tightly to the hips or cut with ample fullness, draped mantles, and flowing pelisses. Side by side with these officials, the laundresses plied their trade, an important one among a people devoted to white, and in whose estimation a lack of cleanliness in dress entailed religious impurity. Like the fellahin of the present time, they took their linen daily to wash in the river. They rinsed, starched, smoothed, and pleated it without intermission to supply the incessant demands of Pharaoh and his family. The task of those set over the jewels was no easy one, considering the enormous variety of necklaces, bracelets, rings, earrings, and richly crafted scepters that ceremonial costume required for particular times and occasions. The guardianship of the crowns almost approached the dignity of the priesthood, for was not the uraeus which ornamented each one a living goddess? The queen required numerous waiting women, and the same ample number of attendants were found in the establishments of the other ladies of the harem. Troops of musicians, singers, dancers, and almes whiled away the tedious hours, supplemented by buffoons and dwarfs. The great Egyptian lords evinced a curious liking for these unfortunate beings, amusing themselves by getting together the ugliest and most deformed creatures. They are often represented on tombs beside their masters, in company with his pet dog, a gazelle, or with a monkey they sometimes hold on a leash or are engaged in teasing. Sometimes the pharaoh bestowed his friendship on his dwarfs, confiding occupations in his household to them. One of them, Khnumhotep-U, died as a superintendent of the royal linen. The staff of servants required for supplying the table exceeded all the others in number. It could scarcely be otherwise if we consider that the master had to provide food not only for his regular servants, but for all his employees and subjects whose business brought them to the royal residence. Even those poor wretches who came to complain to him of some more or less imaginary grievance were fed at his expense while awaiting his judicial verdict. Head cooks, butlers, pantlers, pastry cooks, fishmongers, game or fruit dealers, if all numerated, would be endless. The bakers who baked ordinary bread were not to be confused with those who manufactured biscuits. The makers of pancakes and donuts took precedence over cake bakers, and those who concocted delicate fruit preserves ranked higher than the common dryer of dates. If one had held a post in the royal household, however lowly the occupation, it was something to be proud of all one's life, and, after death, to boast of in one's epitaph. The chiefs to whom this army of servants rendered obedience at times rose from the ranks. On some occasions, he had noticed them in the crowd and had transferred them, some by a single promotion, others by slow degrees, to the highest offices of the state. Many among them, however, belonged to old families and held positions in the palace that their fathers and grandfathers had occupied before them. Some were members of the provincial nobility, distant descendants of former royal princes and princesses, more or less nearly related to the reigning sovereign. They had been sought out to be companions of his education and his pastimes when he was still living an obscure life in the house of the children. He had grown up with them and had kept them about his person as his sole friends and counselors. He lavished titles and offices upon them by the dozen, according to the confidence he felt in their capacity or the amount of faithfulness with which he credited them. A few of the most favored were called masters of the secret of the royal house. They knew all the innermost recesses of the palace, all the passwords needed in going from one part of it to another, the place where the royal treasures were kept, and the modes of access to them. Several of them were masters of the secret of all the royal words, and had authority over the high courtiers of the palace, which gave them the power of banishing whom they pleased from the sovereign's presence. Others devolved the task of arranging his amusements. They rejoiced the heart of his majesty by pleasant songs, while the chiefs of the sailors and soldiers kept watch over his safety. To these active services were attached honorary privileges that were highly esteemed, such as the right to retain their sandals in the palace, while the general crowd of courtiers could only enter unshod, the right to kiss the knees and not the feet of the good god, and the wearing of the panther's skin. Among those who enjoyed these distinctions were the king's physicians, chaplains, and men of the roll, Khri-Habi.
The latter did not confine themselves to guiding Pharaoh through the intricacies of ritual, nor to prompting him with the necessary formulas to make a sacrifice efficacious. They were styled masters of the secrets of heaven, those who see what is in the firmament, on the earth, and in Hades. Those who know all the charms of soothsayers, prophets, or magicians. The laws relating to the government of the seasons and the stars presented no mysteries to them. Neither were they ignorant of the months, days, or hours propitious to the undertakings of everyday life, or the starting out on an expedition, nor of those times during which any action was dangerous. They drew their inspirations from the books of magic written by Thoth, which taught them the art of interpreting dreams, or of curing the sick, or of invoking and obliging the gods to assist them, and of arresting or hastening the progress of the sun on the celestial ocean.
Some are mentioned as being able to divide the waters at their will and to cause them to return to their natural place merely by means of a short formula. An image of a man or animal made by them out of enchanted wax was imbued with life at their command, becoming an irresistible instrument of their wrath. Popular stories reveal them at work. "Is it true," said Cheops to one of them, "that you can replace a head that has been cut off?" On his admitting that he could do so, Pharaoh immediately desired to test his power. "Bring me a prisoner from prison, and let him be slain." The magician at this proposal exclaimed, "Nay, nay, not a man, sire my master. Do not command that this sin should be committed. A fine animal will suffice." A goose was brought. Its head was cut off, and the body was placed on the right side, and the head of the goose on the left side of the hall. He recited what he recited from his book of magic. The goose began to hop forward, the head moved onto it, and when both were united, the goose began to cackle. A pelican was produced, and underwent the same process. His Majesty then caused a bull to be brought forward, and its head was smitten to the ground. The magician recited what he recited. He replaced on it what had fallen to the earth. The great lords themselves deigned to become initiated into the occult sciences, and were invested with these formidable powers. A prince who practiced magic would enjoy but small esteem amongst us nowadays. In Egypt, sorcery was not considered incompatible with royalty, and the magicians of Pharaoh often took Pharaoh himself as his pupil. Such were the king's household, the people about his person, and those attached to the service of his family. His capital sheltered an even greater number of officials and functionaries charged with the administration of his fortune, that is to say, what he possessed in Egypt. In theory, it was always supposed that the whole of the soil belonged to him, but that he and his predecessors had diverted and parceled off such an amount of it for the benefit of their favorites, or for the hereditary lords, that only half of the actual territory remained under his immediate control. He governed most of the nomes of the delta in person. Beyond the Fayum, he merely retained isolated lands, enclosed in the middle of feudal principalities, and often at considerable distance from each other. The extent of the royal domain varied with different dynasties, and even from reign to reign. If it sometimes decreased owing to too frequently repeated concessions, its losses were generally amply compensated by the confiscation of certain fiefs, or by their lapsing to the crown. The domain was always of sufficient extent to oblige the pharaoh to confide the larger portion of it to officials of various kinds, and to farm merely a small remainder of the royal slaves. In the latter case, he reserved for himself all the profits, but at the expense of all the annoyance and all the outlay. In the former case, he obtained, without any risk, the annual dues, the amount of which was fixed on the spot according to the resources of the nome. In order to understand how the government of Egypt was conducted, we should never forget that the world was still ignorant of the use of money, and that gold, silver, and copper, however abundant we may suppose them to have been, were mere articles of exchange, like the most common products of Egyptian soil. Pharaoh was then not, as the state is with us, a treasurer who calculates the total of his receipts and expenses in ready money, banks his revenue in specie occupying but little space, and settles his accounts from the same source. His fiscal receipts were in kind, and it was in kind that he remunerated his servants for their labor. Cattle, cereals, ferment drinks, oils, stuffs, common or precious metals, all that the heavens give, all that the earth produces, all that the Nile brings from its mysterious sources, constituted the coinage in which his subjects paid him their contributions and which he passed on to his vassals by way of salary. One room, a few feet square, and if need be, one safe, might easily contain the entire revenue of one of our modern empires. The largest of our emporiums would not always have been sufficient to hold the mass of incongruous objects that represented the returns of one single Egyptian province. As the products in which the tax was paid took various forms, it was necessary to have an infinite variety of special agents and suitable places to receive it. Herdsmen and sheds for the oxen, measurers and granaries for the grain, butlers and cellarers for the wine, beer, and oils. The product of the tax, while in weight redistribution, could only be kept from deteriorating in value by incessant labor in which a score of different classes of clerks and workmen in the service of the treasury all took part according to their trades. If the tax was received in oxen, it was led to pasture, or at times, when a murrain threatened to destroy it, to the slaughterhouse and the courier. If it was in corn, it was bolted, ground to flour, and made into bread and pastry. If it was in stuffs, it was washed, ironed, and folded to be retailed as garments or in the piece. The royal treasury partook of the character of the farm, the warehouse, and the manufactory. Each of the departments that helped to swell its contents occupied within the palace enclosure a building or group of buildings which was called its house, or as we would say, its storehouse. There was the white storehouse, where the stuffs were kept, and at times the wine. The storehouse of oxen, the gold storehouse, the storehouse of preserved fruits, the storehouse for grain, the storehouse for liquors, and 10 other storehouses whose specific application we aren't always sure of. In the storehouse of weapons, or armory, were ranged thousands of clubs, maces, pikes, daggers, bows, and bundles of arrows, which Pharaoh distributed to his recruits whenever a war forced him to call out his army, and which were again warehoused after the campaign.
It would be difficult to enumerate the number of store chambers in the outbuildings of the storehouse of provisions. Store chambers for butcher's meat, for fruits, for beer, bread, and wine, in which were deposited as much of each article of food as would be required by the court for some days, or at most for a few weeks. They were brought there from the larger storehouses, the wines from vaults, the oxen from their stalls, the corn from the granaries. The latter were vast brick-built receptacles, 10 or more in a row, circular in shape and surmounted by cupolas, but having no communication with each other. They had only 2 openings, one at the top for pouring in the grain, another on the ground level for drawing it out. A notice posted up outside, often on the shutter that closed the chamber, indicated the character and quantity of the cereals within. For the security and management of these, there were employed troops of porters, storekeepers, accountants, primates who supervised the works, record keepers, and directors. Great nobles coveted the administration of the storehouses, and even the sons of kings did not think it derogatory to their dignity to be entitled directors of the granaries or directors of the armory. There was no law against pluralists, and more than one of them boasts on his tomb of having held simultaneously 5 or 6 offices. These storehouses participated, like all the other dependencies of the crown, in that duality which characterized the person of the pharaoh. They would be called in common parlance the storehouse, or the double white storehouse, the storehouse, or the double gold storehouse,
the double warehouse, the double granary. The large towns, as well as the capital, possessed their double storehouses and their store chambers, into which were gathered the products of the neighborhood, but where a complete staff of employees was not always required. In such towns, we meet with localities in which the commodities were housed merely temporarily. The least perishable part of the provincial dues was forwarded by boat to the royal residence and swelled the central treasury. The remainder was used on the spot for paying workmen's wages and for the needs of the administration. We see from the inscriptions that the staff of officials who administered affairs in the provinces was similar to that in the royal city. Starting from the top and going down to the bottom of the scale, each functionary supervised those beneath him, while as a body they were all responsible for their depot. Any irregularity in the entries entailed the bastinado. Peculators were punished by imprisonment, mutilation, or death according to the gravity of the offense. Those whom illness or old age rendered unfit for work were pensioned for the remainder of their life. The writer, or as we call him, the scribe, was the mainspring of all this machinery. We come across him in all grades of the staff: an insignificant registrar of oxen, a clerk of the double white storehouse, ragged, humble, and badly paid. Was a scribe just as much as the noble, the priest, or the king's son. Thus, the title of scribe was of no value in itself, and did not designate, as one might naturally think, a savant, educated in a school of high culture, or a man of the world, versed in the sciences and the literature of his time. A scribe merely knew how to read, write, and cipher, was fairly proficient in wording administrative formulas, and could easily apply the elementary rules of bookkeeping. There was no public school in which the scribe could be prepared for his future career. But as soon as a child had acquired the first rudiments of letters with some old pedagogue, his father took him with him to his office or entrusted him to some friend who agreed to undertake his education. The apprentice observed what went on around him, imitated the procedures of the employees, copied in his spare time old papers, letters, bills, flowery worded petitions, reports, complimentary addresses to his superiors or to the pharaoh, all of which his patron examined and corrected, noting on the margin letters or words imperfectly written, improving the style, and recasting or completing incorrect expressions. As soon as he could put together a certain number of sentences or figures without a mistake, he was allowed to draw up bills or to have sole superintendence of some department of the treasury, his work gradually increasing in amount and difficulty. When he was considered to be sufficiently au courant with the ordinary business, his education was declared to be finished, and a situation was found for him either in the place where he had begun his probation or in some neighboring office. Thus equipped, the young man usually ended by succeeding his father or his patron. In most government administrations, we find whole dynasties of scribes on a small scale, whose members inherited the same post for several centuries. The position was insignificant, and the salary was poor, but the means of existence were assured. The occupant was exempted from forced labor and from military service, and he exercised a certain authority in the narrow world in which he lived. It sufficed him to think himself happy, and in fact, to be so. "One has only to be a scribe," said the wise man, "for the scribe takes the lead of all." Sometimes, however, one of these contented officials, more intelligent or ambitious than his fellows, succeeded in rising above the common mediocrity. His fine handwriting, the happy choice of his sentences, his activity, his obliging manner, his honesty, perhaps also his discreet dishonesty, attracted the attention of his superiors and were the cause of his promotion. the son of a peasant or some poor wretch who had begun life by keeping a register of bread and vegetables in some provincial government office, had often been known to crown his long and successful career by exercising a kind of vice-regency over half of Egypt. His granaries overflowed with corn. His storehouses were always full of gold, fine stuffs, and precious vases. His stalls multiplied the backs of his oxen. The sons of his early patrons, now his protégés, did not venture to approach him except with bowed head and bended knee. No doubt the Amtun's tomb was removed to Berlin by Lepsius and put together piece by piece in the museum. He was born more than 4,000 years before our era, under one of the last kings of the Third Dynasty, and he lived until the reign of the first king of the Fourth Dynasty, Snufri. He probably came from the nome of the bull, if not from Zois itself in the heart of the delta. His father, the scribe Anupamanku, held in addition to his office several landed estates, producing large returns. But his mother, Nibsunet, who appears to have been merely a concubine, had no personal fortune and would have been unable to even give her child an education. Anupamanku made himself entirely responsible for the necessary expenses, giving him all the necessities of life at the time when he had not yet either corn, barley, income, house, men or servants, or troops of asses, pigs, or oxen.
As soon as he was in a condition to provide for himself, his father obtained for him, in his native nome, the post of chief scribe attached to one of the localities that belonged to the administration of provisions. On behalf of the pharaoh, the young man received, registered, and distributed the meat, cakes, fruits, and fresh vegetables that constituted the taxes, all on his own responsibility, except that he had to give an account of them to the director of the storehouse, who was nearest to him. We are not told how long he remained in this occupation. We see merely that he was raised successively to posts of an analogous kind, but of increasing importance. The provincial offices comprised a small staff of employees, consisting always of the same officials: a chief, whose ordinary function was director of the storehouse, a few scribes to keep the accounts, one or two of whom added to his ordinary calling that of keeper of the archives, paid ushers to introduce clients, and, if need be, to bastinado them summarily at the order of the director. Lastly, the strong of voice, the criers who superintended the incomings and outgoings and proclaimed the account of them to the scribes to be noted down forthwith. A vigilant and honest crier was a man of great value. He obliged the taxpayer not only to deliver the exact number of measures prescribed as his quota, but also compelled him to deliver good measures in each case. A dishonest crier, on the contrary, could easily favor cheating, provided that he shared in the spoil. Amten was at once crier and taxer of the colonists to the civil administrator of the Chaldæa nome. He announced the names of the peasants and the payments they made, then estimated the amount of the local tax which each, according to his income, had to pay. He distinguished himself so preeminently in these delicate duties that the civil administrator of Choice made him one of his subordinates. He became chief of the ushers, afterwards master crier, then director of all the king's flax in the Chaldæa nome, an office that entailed on him the supervision of the culture, cutting, and general preparation of flax for the manufacture that was carried on in Pharaoh's own domain. It was one of the highest offices in the provincial administration, and Amten must have congratulated himself on his appointment. From that moment his career became a great one, and he advanced quickly. Up to that time he had been confined to offices. He now left them to perform more active service. The pharaohs, extremely jealous of their own authority, usually avoided placing a single ruler, who would have appeared too much like a prince, at the head of the nomes in their domain.
they preferred having in each center of civil administration governors of the town or province, as well as military commanders who were jealous of one another, supervised one another, counterbalanced one another, and did not remain in office long enough to become dangerous. Amten held all these posts successively in most of the nomes situated in the center or to the west of the delta. His first appointment was to the government of the village of Pidosu, an unimportant post in itself, but one that entitled him to a staff of office, and in consequence procured for him one of the greatest indulgences of vanity that an Egyptian could enjoy. The staff was in fact a symbol of command, which only the nobles and the officials associated with the nobility could carry without transgressing custom. The assumption of it, as that of the sword with us, showed everyone that the bearer was a member of a privileged class. Amten was no sooner ennobled than his functions began to expand. Villages were rapidly added to villages, then towns to towns, including such an important one as Buto, and finally the nomes of the Harpoon, of the Bull, of the Silurus, the western half of the Saite nome, the nome of the Haunch, and a part of the Fayulim came within his jurisdiction. The western half of the Saite nome, where he long resided, corresponded with what was later called the Libyan nome. It reached nearly from the apex of the delta to the sea, and was bounded on one side by the Canopic branch of the Nile, on the other by the Libyan range. A part of the desert, as well as the oases, fell under its rule. It included among its population, as did many of the provinces of Upper Egypt, regiments composed of nomadic hunters who were compelled to pay their tribute in living or dead game. Amten was metamorphosed into chief huntsman, scoured the mountains with his men, and thereupon became one of the most important personages in the defense of the country. The pharaohs had built fortified stations and had, from time to time, constructed walls at certain points where the roads entered the valley, at Syene, at Coptos, and at the entrance of the Wadi Tumulot. Amten undertook to protect the frontier against the wandering Bedouin from the other side of Lake Mareotis. His duties as chief huntsman had been the best preparation he could have had for this arduous task. They had forced him to make incessant expeditions among the mountains, to explore the gorges and ravines, to be acquainted with the routes marked by wells which the mayors were obliged to follow in their incursions, and the pathways and passes by which they could descend into the plain of the delta. In running the game to earth, he had gained all the knowledge needed for repulsing the enemy. Such a combination of capabilities made Amten the most important noble in this part of Egypt. When old age at last prevented him from leading an active life, he accepted, by way of a pension, the governorship of the nome of the Haunch. With civil authority, military command, local priestly functions, and honorary distinctions, he lacked only one thing to make him the equal of the nobles of the ancient family: permission to bequeath without restriction his towns and offices to his children. His private fortune was not as great as we might be led to think. He inherited from his father only one estate, but had acquired 12 others in the nomes of the delta, where his successive appointments had led him, namely in the Saite, Shoite, and Lipolite nomes. He received subsequently, as a reward for his services, 200 portions of cultivated land, with numerous peasants, both male and female, and an income of 100 loaves daily, a first charge on the funeral provision of Queen Hapunimite. He took advantage of this windfall to endow his family suitably. His only son was already provided for, thanks to the munificence of Pharaoh. He had begun his administrative career by holding the same post of scribe, in addition to the office of provision registrar which his father had held, and over and above these, he received by royal grant 4 portions of corn land, with their population and stock. Amten gave 12 portions to his other children and 50 to his mother Nibsonjet, by means of which she lived comfortably in her old age and left an annuity for maintaining worship at her tomb. he built on the remainder of the land a magnificent villa, of which he has considerately left us the description. The boundary wall formed a square of 350 feet on each face, and consequently contained a surface area of 125,500 square feet. The well-built dwelling house, completely furnished with all the necessities of life, was surrounded by ornamental and fruit-bearing trees, the common palm, the nebec, fig trees, and acacias. Several ponds, neatly bordered with greenery, afforded a habitat for aquatic birds. Trellised vines, according to custom, ran frequently in front of the house, and 2 plots of ground planted with vines in full bearing amply supplied the owner with wine every year.
It was there, doubtless, that Amton ended his days in peace and quietude of mind. The tableland where the Sphinx has watched for so many centuries was then crowned by no pyramids, but mastabas of fine white stone rose here and there out of the sand. That in which the mummy of Amton was to be enclosed was situated not far from the modern village of Abu Sir, on the confines of the Nome of the Honch, and almost in sight of the mansion in which his declining years were spent. The number of persons of obscure origin who in this manner had risen in a few years to the highest honors and died governors of provinces or ministers of Pharaoh must have been considerable. Their descendants followed in their fathers' footsteps until the day came when royal favor or an advantageous marriage secured them the possession of an hereditary fief and transformed the son or grandson of a prosperous scribe into a feudal lord. It was from people of this class and from the children of the pharaoh that the nobility was mostly recruited. In the Delta, where the authority of the pharaoh was almost everywhere directly felt, the power of the nobility was weakened and much curtailed. In Middle Egypt, it gained ground and became stronger and stronger in proportion as one advanced southward. The nobles held the principalities of the gazelle, of the hare, of the serpent mountain, of Akhmim, of Thinis, of Kasr es Sayad, of El Kab, of Aswan, and doubtless others of which we shall someday discover the monuments. They accepted without difficulty the fiction according to which the pharaoh claimed to be absolute master of the soil and ceded to his subjects only the usufruct of their fiefs. But apart from the admission of the principle, each lord proclaimed himself sovereign in his own domain and exercised in it, on a small scale, complete royal authority. Everything within the limits of this petty state belonged to him: woods, canals, fields, even the desert sand. After the example of the pharaoh, he farmed a part himself and let out the remainder, either in farms or as fiefs, to those of his followers who had gained his confidence or his friendship. After the example of Pharaoh also, he was a priest and exercised priestly functions in relation to all the gods, that is, not of all Egypt, but of all the deities of the nome. He was an administrator of civil and criminal law, received the complaints of his vassals and serfs at the gate of his palace, and against his decisions there was no appeal. He kept up a flotilla and raised on his estate a small army of which he was the commander-in-chief by hereditary right. He inhabited a fortified mansion situated sometimes within the capital of the principality itself, sometimes in its neighborhood, and in which the arrangements of the royal city were reproduced on a smaller scale. Side by side with the reception halls was the harem, where the legitimate wife, often a princess of solar rank, played the role of queen, surrounded by concubines, dancers, and slaves. The offices of the various departments were crowded into the enclosure, with their directors, governors, scribes of all ranks, custodians, and workmen who bore the same titles as the corresponding employees in the departments of the state.
Their white storehouse, their gold storehouse, their granary were at times called the double white storehouse, the double gold storehouse, the double granary, just as those of the pharaoh. Amusements at the court of the vassal did not differ from that of the sovereign. Hunting in the desert and the marshes, fishing, inspection of agricultural works, military exercises, games, songs, dancing, doubtless the recital of long stories and exhibitions of magic, even down to the contortions of the court buffoon and the grimaces of the dwarfs. It amused the prince to see one of these wretched favorites leading to him by the paw a cynocephalus larger than himself, while a mischievous monkey slyly pulled the tame and stately ibis by the tail. From time to time, the great lord proceeded to inspect his domain. On these occasions, he traveled in a kind of sedan chair, supported by 2 mules yoked together, or he was borne in a palanquin by some 30 men while fanned by large flabella. Or possibly he went up the Nile and the canals in his beautiful painted barge. The life of the Egyptian lords may be aptly described as in every respect an exact reproduction of the life of the pharaoh on a smaller scale. Inheritance in a direct or indirect line was the rule, but in every case of transmission, the new lord had to receive the investiture of the sovereign, either by letter or in person. The duties enforced by the feudal state do not appear to have been onerous. In the first place, there was the regular payment of a tribute, proportionate to the extent and resources of the fief. In the next place, there was military service. The vassal agreed to supply, when called upon, a fixed number of armed men whom he himself commanded, unless he could offer a reasonable excuse such as illness or senile incapacity. Attendance at court was not obligatory. We notice, however, many nobles about the person of the pharaoh, and there are numerous examples of princes with whose lives we are familiar, filling offices which appear to have demanded at least a temporary residence in the palace, as for instance the charge of the royal wardrobe. When the king traveled, the great vassals were compelled to entertain him and his suite and to escort him to the frontier of their domain. On these occasions, the king would often take away one of their sons to be brought up with his own children, an act which they on their part considered a great honor, while the king on his had a guarantee of their fidelity in the person of these hostages. Such young people as returned to their father's roof when their education was finished were usually most loyal to the reigning dynasty. They often brought back with them some maiden born in the purple who consented to share their little provincial sovereignty, while in exchange one or more of their sisters entered the harem of the pharaoh. Marriages made and marred, in turn, the fortunes of the great feudal houses. Whether she was a princess or not, each woman received as her dowry a portion of territory and enlarged by that amount her husband's little state. But the property she brought might in a few years be taken by her daughters as portions and enrich other houses. The fief seldom could bear up against this dismemberment. It fell away piecemeal and by the 3rd or 4th generation had disappeared. Sometimes, however, it gained more than it lost in this matrimonial game, and extended its borders till they encroached on neighboring nomes, or else completely absorbed them. There were always in the course of each reign several great principalities formed, or in the process of formation, whose chiefs might be said to hold in their hands the destinies of the country. The pharaoh himself was obliged to treat them with deference, and he purchased their allegiance by renewed and ever-increasing concessions.
Their ambition was never satisfied. When they were loaded with favors and did not venture to ask for more for themselves, they impudently demanded them for such of their children as they thought were poorly provided for. Their eldest son knew not the high favors which came from the king. Other princes were his privy counselors, his chosen friends, or foremost among his friends.
He had no share in all this. Pharaoh took good care not to reject a petition presented so humbly. He proceeded to lavish appointments, titles, and estates on the son in question. If necessity required it, he would even seek out a wife for him, who might give him, together with her hand, a property equal to that of his father. The majority of these great vassals secretly aspired to the crown. They frequently had reason to believe that they had some right to it, either through their mother or one of their ancestors. Had they combined against the reigning house, they could easily have gained the upper hand, but their mutual jealousies prevented this, and the overthrow of a dynasty to which they owed so much would, for the most part, have profited them but little. As soon as one of them revolted, the remainder took arms in Pharaoh's defense, led his armies, and fought his battles. If at times their ambition and greed harassed their suzerain, at least their power was at his service, and their self-interested allegiance was often the means of delaying the downfall of his house. Two things were especially needed both for them and for Pharaoh in order to maintain or increase their authority: the protection of the gods and a military organization which enabled them to mobilize the whole of their forces at the first signal. The celestial world was the faithful image of our own. It had its empires and feudal organization, the arrangement of which corresponded to that of the terrestrial world. The gods who inhabited it were dependent upon the gifts of mortals, and the resources of each individual deity, and consequently his power, depended on the wealth and number of his worshippers. Anything influencing one had an immediate effect on the other. The gods dispensed happiness, health, and vigor. To those who made them large offerings and instituted pious foundations, they lent their own weapons and inspired them with needful strength to overcome their enemies. They even came down to assist in battle, and every great encounter of armies involved an invisible struggle amongst the immortals. The gods of the side which was victorious shared with it in the triumph, and received a tithe of the spoil as the price of their help. The gods of the vanquished were so much the poorer. Their priests and their statues were reduced to slavery, and the destruction of their people entailed their own downfall. It was therefore to the special interest of everyone in Egypt, from the pharaoh to the humblest of his vassals, to maintain the goodwill and power of the gods, so that their protection might be effectively ensured in the hour of danger. Pains were taken to embellish their temples with obelisks, colossi, altars, and bas-reliefs. New buildings were added to the old. The parts threatened with ruin were restored or entirely rebuilt. Daily gifts were brought of every kind, animals which were sacrificed on the spot. Bread, flowers, fruit, drinks, as well as perfumes, stuffs, vases, jewels, bricks or bars of gold, silver, lapis lazuli, which were all heaped up in the treasury within the recesses of the crypts. If the dignitary of high rank wished to perpetuate the remembrance of his honors or his services, and at the same time to procure for his double the benefit of endless prayers and sacrifices, he placed by special permission a statue of himself on a votive stela in the part of the temple reserved for this purpose. In a courtyard, chamber, encircling passage as at Karnak, or on the staircase of Osiris as in that leading up to the terrace in the sanctuary of Abydos. He then sealed a formal agreement with the priests by which the latter engaged to perform a service in his name in front of this commemorative monument a stated number of times in the year on the days fixed by universal observance or by local custom. For this purpose he assigned to them annuities in kind, charges on his patrimonial estates, or, in some cases, if he were a great lord, on the revenues of his fief, such as a fixed quantity of loaves and drinks for each of the celebrants, a quarter part of the sacrificial victim, a garment, frequently also lands with their cattle, serfs, existing buildings, farming implements, and produce, along with the conditions of service with which the lands were burdened. These gifts to the god, Noter Hatpu, were, it appears, effected by agreements analogous to those dealing with property in Mortmain in modern Egypt. In each nome, they constituted, in addition to the original temporalities of the temple, a considerable domain, constantly enlarged by fresh endowments. The gods had no daughters for whom to provide or sons among whom to divide their inheritance. All that fell to them remained theirs forever, and in the contracts were inserted imprecations threatening with terrible ills in this world and the next those who should abstract the smallest portion from them. These menaces did not always prevent the king or the lords from laying hands on the temple revenues. Had this not been the case, Egypt would soon have become a sacerdotalical country from one end to another. Even reduced by periodic usurpations, the domain of the gods formed, at all periods, about 1/3 of the whole country. Its administration was not vested in a single body of priests representing all of Egypt and recruited or ruled everywhere in the same fashion. There were as many bodies of priests as there were temples, and every temple preserved its independent constitution with which the clergy of the adjoining temples had nothing to do. The only master they acknowledged was the lord of the territory on which the temple was built, either Pharaoh or one of his nobles. The tradition that made Pharaoh the head of the different worships in Egypt prevailed everywhere. But Pharaoh soared so far above this world that he confined himself to the functions of any one particular order of priests. He officiated before all the gods without being specially the minister of any one, and only exerted his supremacy in order to make appointments to important sacerdotalical posts in his domain. He reserved the high priesthood of the Memphite Ptah and that of Ra of Heliopolis either for the princes of his own family or more often for his most faithful servants. They were the docile instruments of his will, through whom he exerted the influence of the gods and disposed of their property without having the trouble of administering it. The feudal lords, less removed from mortal affairs than the pharaoh, did not disdain to combine the priesthood of the temples dependent on them with the general supervision of the different worships practiced on their lands. The princes of the Gazelle nome, for instance, bore the title Directors of the Prophets of all the gods, but were, correctly speaking, prophets of Horus, of Khnumu, master of Hawirit, and of Pakit, mistress of the Spios Artemidos. The religious suzerainty of such princes was the complement of their civil and military power, and their ordinary income was augmented by some part at least of the revenues which the lands in Mortmain furnished annually.
The subordinate sacerdotal functions were filled by professional priests whose status varied according to the gods they served and the provinces in which they were located. Although between the mere priest and the chief prophet, there were a number of grades to which the majority never attained, still the temples attracted many people from diverse sources who, once established in this calling of life, not only never left it, but never rested until they had introduced into it the members of their families. The offices they filled were not necessarily hereditary, but the children born and bred in the shelter of the sanctuary almost always succeeded to the positions of their fathers. And certain families, thus continuing in the same occupation for generations, at last came to be established as a sort of sacerdotal nobility. The sacrifices supplied them with daily meat and drink. The temple buildings provided their lodgings, and its revenues furnished them with a salary proportional to their position. They were exempted from ordinary taxes, from military service, and from forced labor. It is not surprising, therefore, that those who were not actually members of priestly families strove to have at least a share in their advantages. The servitors, workmen, and employees who congregated about them and constituted the temple corporation, the scribes attached to the administration of the domains and to the receipt of offerings, shared, de facto, if not de jure, in the immunity of the priesthood.
As a body, they formed a separate religious society, side by side with but distinct from the civil population and freed from most of the burdens which weighed so heavily on the latter. The soldiers were far from possessing the wealth and influence of the clergy. Military service in Egypt was not universally compulsory, but rather the profession and privilege of a special class, of whose origin little is known. Perhaps originally it comprised only the descendants of the conquering race, but in historic times it was not exclusively confined to them. Recruits were raised everywhere among the Fellahs, the Bedouin of the neighborhood, the Negroes, the Nubians, and even from among prisoners of war or adventurers from beyond the sea. This motley collection of foreign mercenaries ordinarily composed the bodyguard of the king or his barons, forming the permanent nucleus around which, in times of war, the levies of native recruits were rallied. Every Egyptian soldier received from his chief a holding of land for the maintenance of himself and his family. In the 5th century BC, 12 arura of arable land was estimated as ample pay for each man, and tradition attributes to the fabulous Sesostris the law which fixed the pay at this rate. The soldiers were not taxed and were exempt from forced labor during their active service away from home. With this exception, they were liable to the same charges as the rest of the population. Many among them possessed no other income and lived the precarious life of the fellah, tilling, reaping, drawing water, and pasturing their cattle in the interval between two musters. Others with private fortunes let their holdings out at a moderate rental, which formed an addition to their patrimonial income. He supervised the redistribution of the lands, the registration of privileges, and in addition to his administrative functions, he had in time of war the command of the troops furnished by his own district. In such cases, he was assisted by a lieutenant, who, as opportunity offered, acted as his substitute in the office or on the battlefield. Military service was not hereditary, but its advantages, however trifling they may appear to us, seemed in the eyes of the fellahs so great that for the most part those engaged in it also had their children enrolled. While still young, the latter were taken to the barracks where they were taught not only the use of the bow, the battle axe, the mace, the lance, and the shield, but were also instructed in exercises that rendered the body supple and prepared them for maneuvering, regimental marching, running, jumping, and wrestling, either with closed or open hand. They prepared themselves for battle by regular war dance, pirouetting, leaping, and brandishing their bows and quivers in the air. After their training finished, they were incorporated into local companies and invested in their privileges. When required for service, part or the whole of the class was mustered. Arms kept in the arsenal were distributed among them, and they were conveyed in boats to the scene of action. The Egyptians were not martial by temperament. They became soldiers rather from interest than inclination. The power of Pharaoh and his barons rested entirely on these two classes, the priests and the soldiers. The remainder, the commonalty and the peasantry, were in their hands merely an inert mass to be taxed and subjected to forced labor at will. The slaves were probably regarded as of little importance. The bulk of the people consisted of free families who were at liberty to dispose of themselves and their goods. Every fellah and townsman in the service of the king or of one of his great nobles could leave his work in his village when he pleased, could pass from the domain in which he was born into a different one, and could traverse the country from one end to another, as the Egyptians of today still do. His absence entailed no loss of goods or persecution of the relatives he left behind, and he himself had punishment to fear only when he left the Nile Valley without permission to reside for some time in a foreign land. But although this independence and liberty were in accordance with the laws and customs of the land, yet they gave rise to inconveniences from which it was difficult to escape in practical life. Every Egyptian, the king excepted, was obliged in order to get on in life to depend on one more powerful than himself, whom he called his master. The feudal lord was proud to recognize Pharaoh as its master, and he himself was master of the soldiers and priests in his own petty state. From the top to the bottom of the social scale, every free man acknowledged a master who secured to him justice and protection in exchange for his obedience and fealty. The moment an Egyptian tried to withdraw himself from this subjection, the peace of his life was at an end.
He became a man without a home or a master, and therefore without a recognized protector. Anyone might stop him on the way, steal his cattle, merchandise, or property on the most trivial pretext, and if he attempted to protest, might beat him with almost certain impunity. The only recourse for the victim was to sit at the palace gate waiting to appeal for justice until the lord or the king appeared. If, by chance, after many rejections, his humble petition were granted, it was only the beginning of fresh troubles. Even if the justice of his cause was indisputable, the fact that he was a man without a home or master inspired his judges with an obstinate mistrust, delaying the satisfaction of his claims. In vain, he followed his judges with complaints and flattery, chanting their virtues in every key. "Thou art the father of the unfortunate, the husband of the widow, the brother of the orphan, the clothing of the motherless. Enable me to proclaim your name as a law throughout the land. Good Lord, guide without caprice, great without littleness, thou who destroyest falsehood and causes truth to be. Come at the words of my mouth. I speak, listen, and do justice. O generous, generous of the generous, destroy the cause of my trouble. Here I am, uplift me, judge me, for behold me, a suppliant before you."
If he were an eloquent speaker and the judge were inclined to listen, he was willingly heard, but his cause made no progress. Delays, counted on by his adversary, led to his ruin. Religious law, no doubt, prescribed equitable treatment for all devotees of Osiris and condemned the slightest departure from justice as one of the gravest sins, even for a great noble or the king himself. But how could impartiality be shown when one party was the recognized protector, the master of the culprit, while the plaintiff was a vagabond, attached to no one, a man without a master? The population of the towns included many privileged persons other than soldiers, priests, or those engaged in temple service. Those employed in royal or feudal administration, from the superintendent of the storehouse to the humblest scribe, though perhaps not entirely exempt from forced labor, had only a small part of it to bear. These employees constituted a middle class of several grades and enjoyed a fixed income and regular employment. They were fairly well educated, very self-satisfied, and always ready to declare loudly their superiority over anyone obliged to earn a living by manual labor. Each class of workmen recognized one or more chiefs. The shoemakers, their master shoemakers. The masons, their master masons. The blacksmiths, their master blacksmiths, who looked after their interests and represented them before the local authorities. It was said among the Greeks that even robbers were united in a corporation like the others and maintained an accredited superior as their representative with the police to discuss the somewhat delicate questions which the practice of their trade gave occasion to. When the members of the association had stolen any object of value, it was to this superior that the person robbed resorted in order to regain possession of it. It was he who fixed the amount required for its redemption and returned it without fail upon the payment of this sum. Most of the workmen who formed a state corporation lodged, or at least all of them had their stalls in the same quarter or street under the direction of their chief. Besides the poll and house tax, they were subject to a special toll, a trade license which they paid in products of their commerce or industry. Their lot was a hard one, if we are to believe the description which ancient writers have handed down to us. I have never seen a blacksmith on an embassy, nor a smelter sent on a mission. But what I have seen is the metal worker at his toil, at the mouth of the furnace of his forge, his fingers as rugged as the crocodile, and stinking more than fish spawn. The artisan of any kind who handles the chisel does not employ so much movement as he who handles the hoe. But for him, his fields are the timber, his business is the metal. And at night, when the other is free, he works with his hands over and above what he has already done, for at night he works at home by the lamp. The stonecutter who seeks his living by working in all kinds of durable stone, when at last he has earned something and his 2 arms are worn out, he stops. But if at sunrise he remains sitting, his legs are tied to his back. The barber who shaves until the evening, when he falls and eats, it is without sitting down, while running from street to street to seek custom. If he is constant at work, his 2 arms fill his belly as the bee eats in proportion to its toil. Shall I tell thee of the mason, how he endures misery, exposed to all the winds while he builds without any garment but a belt? And while the bunch of lotus flowers which is fixed on the completed houses is still far out of his reach, his 2 arms are worn out with work. His provisions are placed higgledy-piggledy amongst his refuse. He consumes himself, for he has no other bread than his fingers, and he becomes wearied all at once. He is much and dreadfully exhausted, for there is always a block to be dragged in this or that building, a block of 10 cubits by 6. There is always a block to be dragged in this or that month as far as the scaffolding poles to which is fixed the bunch of lotus flowers on the completed houses. When the work is quite finished, if he has bread, he returns home, and his children have been beaten unmercifully during his absence. The weaver within doors is worse off there than a woman. Squatting, his knees against his chest, he does not breathe. If during the day he slackens weaving, he is bound as fast as the lotuses of the lake. And it is by giving bread to the doorkeeper that the latter permits him to see the light. The dyer, his fingers reeking, and their smell is that of fish spawn. His 2 eyes are oppressed with fatigue. His hand does not stop. And as he spends his time cutting out rags, he has a hatred of garments. The shoemaker is very unfortunate. He moans ceaselessly. His health is the health of the spawning fish, and he gnaws the leather. The baker makes dough, subjects the loaves to the fire. While his head is inside the oven, his son holds him by the legs. If he slips from the hands of his son, he falls there into the flames. These are the miseries inherent to the trades themselves. The levying of the tax added to the catalogue a long sequel of vexations and annoyances which were renewed several times in the year at regular intervals. Even at the present day, the fellah pays his contributions only under protest and by compulsion. But the determination to not meet obligations except beneath the stick was proverbial from ancient times. Whoever paid his dues before he had received a merciless beating would be overwhelmed with reproaches by his family and jeered at without pity by his neighbors. The time when the tax fell due came upon the nomes as a terrible crisis which affected the whole population. For several days there was nothing to be heard but protestations, threats, beating, cries of pain from the taxpayers, and piercing lamentations from women and children. The performance over, calm was reestablished, and the good people, binding up their wounds, resumed their round of daily life until the next tax gathering. The towns of this period presented nearly the same confined and mysterious appearance as those of the present day. They were grouped around one or more temples, each of which was surrounded by its own brick wall enclosure, with its enormous gateways. The gods dwelt there in real castles, or, if this word appears too ambitious, read-outs, in which the population could take refuge in cases of sudden attack, and where they could be in safety. The towns, which had all been built at one period by some king or prince, were on a tolerably regular ground plan. The streets were paved and fairly wide. They crossed each other at right angles and were bordered with buildings on the same line of frontage. The cities of ancient origin, which had increased with the chance growth of centuries, presented a totally different aspect. A network of narrow, dark, damp, and badly built lanes and blind alleys spread itself out between the houses, apparently at random. Here and there was an arm of a canal, all but dried up, or a muddy pool where the cattle came to drink and from which the women fetched the water for their households. Then followed an open space of irregular shape, shaded by acacias or sycamores, where the country folk of the suburbs held their market on certain days, twice or three times a month. Then came waste ground covered with filth and refuse, over which the dogs of the neighborhood fought with hawks and vultures.
The residence of the prince or royal governor and the houses of rich private persons covered a considerable area, and generally presented to the street a long extent of bare walls, crenellated like those of a fortress. The only ornament admitted on them consisted of angular grooves, each surmounted by two open lotus flowers having their stems intertwined. Within these walls, domestic life was entirely secluded, and as it were confined to its own resources. The pleasure of watching passers-by was sacrificed to the advantage of not being seen from outside. The entrance alone denoted at times the importance of the great man who concealed himself within the enclosure. 2 or 3 steps led up to the door, which sometimes had a columned portico, ornamented with statues, lending an air of importance to the building. The houses of the citizens were small and built of brick. They contained, however, some half-dozen rooms, either vaulted or having flat roofs, and communicating with each other usually by arched doorways. A few houses boasted 2 or 3 stories. All possessed a terrace on which the Egyptians of old, like those of today, passed most of their time, attending to household cares or gossiping with their neighbors over the party wall or across the street. The hearth was hollowed out in the ground, usually against a wall, and the smoke escaped through a hole in the ceiling. They made their fires of sticks, wood charcoal, and the dung of oxen and asses. In the houses of the rich we meet with state apartments, lighted in the center by a square opening and supported by rows of wooden columns. The shafts, which were octagonal, measured 10 inches in diameter and were fixed into flat circular stone bases. The family crowded themselves together into 2 or 3 rooms in winter and slept on the roof in the open air in summer, in spite of risk from affections of the stomach and eyes. The remainder of the dwelling was used for stables or warehouses. The store chambers were often built in pairs. They were of brick, carefully lime-washed internally, and usually assumed the form of an elongated cone in imitation of the government storehouses. For the valuables which constituted the wealth of each household, wedges of gold or silver, precious stones, ornaments for men or women, there were places of concealment in which the possessors attempted to hide them from robbers or from the tax collectors. But the latter, accustomed to the craft of the citizens, evinced a peculiar aptitude for ferreting out the hoard. They tapped the walls, lifted and pierced the roofs, dug down into the soil below the foundations, and often brought to light not only the treasure of the owner, but all the surroundings of the grave and human corruption. It was actually the custom among the lower and middle classes to bury in the middle of the house children who had died at the breast. The little body was placed in an old tool or linen box without any attempt at embalming, and its favorite playthings and amulets were buried with it. 2 or 3 infants are often found occupying the same coffin. The playthings were of an artless but very varied character. Dolls of limestone, enameled pottery or wood with movable arms and wigs of artificial hair, pigs, crocodiles, ducks, and pigeons on wheels, pottery boats, miniature sets of household furniture, skin balls filled with hay, marbles, and stone bowls. However strange it may appear, we have to fancy the small boys of ancient Egypt as playing at bowls like ours, or impudently whipping their tops along the streets without respect for the legs of the passers-by. Some care was employed upon the decoration of the chambers.
The rough casting of mud often preserves its original gray color. However, it was lime-washed and colored red or yellow, or decorated with pictures of jars, provisions, and the interiors as well as the exteriors of houses. The bed was not on legs, but consisted of a low framework, like the angadebs of the modern Nubians, or of mats which were folded up in the daytime. But upon these they lay in their clothes during the night, the head being supported by a headrest of pottery, limestone, or wood. The remaining articles of furniture consisted of one or two roughly hewn seats of stone, a few lion-legged chairs or stools, boxes and trunks of varying sizes for linen and implements, coal or perfume pots of alabaster or porcelain, and lastly the fire stick and the bow by which it was set in motion, and some roughly made pots and pans of clay or bronze. Men rarely entered their houses except to eat and sleep. Their employment or handicrafts were such as to require them for the most part to work out of doors. The middle-class families owned almost always one or two slaves, either purchased or born in the house, who did all the hard work. They looked after the cattle, watched over the children, acted as cooks, and fetched water from the nearest pool or well. Among the poor, the drudgery of the household fell entirely upon the woman. She spun, wove, cut out and mended garments, fetched fresh water and provisions, cooked the dinner, and made the daily bread. She spread some handfuls of grain on an oblong slab of stone, slightly hollowed on its upper surface, and proceeded to crush them with a smaller stone like a painter's muller, which she moistened from time to time. For an hour and more she labored with her arms, shoulders, loins, in fact all her body, but an indifferent result followed from the great exertion. The flour, made to undergo several grindings in this rustic mortar, was coarse, uneven, mixed with bran or whole grains which had escaped the pestle and contaminated with dust and abraded particles of the stone. She kneaded it with a little water, blended with it as a sort of yeast a piece of stale dough of the day before, and made from the mass round cakes about 1/2 inch thick and some 4 inches in diameter, which she placed on a flat flint, covering them with hot ashes. The bread, imperfectly raised, often badly cooked, borrowed from the organic fuel under which it was buried a special odor and a taste to which strangers did not readily accustom themselves. The impurities which it contained were sufficient in the long run to ruin the strongest teeth. Eating it was an action of grinding rather than chewing, and old men were not infrequently met with whose teeth had been gradually worn away to the level of the gums, like those of an aged ass or ox. Movement and animation were not lacking at certain hours of the day, particularly in the morning, in the markets and in the neighborhood of the temples and government buildings. There was little traffic anywhere else. The streets were silent, and the town dull and sleepy. It woke up completely only 3 or 4 times a year at seasons of solemn assemblies of heaven and earth. The houses were then opened, and their inhabitants streamed forth, the lively crowd thronging the squares and crossways. To begin with, there was New Year's Day, quickly followed by the festival of the bead, the Ugait. On the night of the 17th of Thought, the priests kindled before the statues in the sanctuaries and sepulchral chapels the fire for the use of the gods and doubles during the 12 ensuing months. Almost at the same moment, the whole country was lit up from one end to another. There was scarcely a family, however poor, who did not place in front of their door a new lamp in which burned an oil saturated with salt, and who did not spend the whole night feasting and gossiping with their neighbors. The festivals of the living gods attracted considerable crowds, who came not only from the nearest nomes, but also from great distances in caravans and in boats laden with merchandise, for religious sentiment did not exclude commercial interests, and the pilgrimage ended in a fair.
For several days, the people occupied themselves solely in prayers, sacrifices, and processions, in which the faithful, clad in white, with palms in their hands, chanted hymns as they escorted the priests on their way. The gods of heaven exclaim, "Ah, ah," in satisfaction. The inhabitants of the earth are full of gladness. The Hathors beat their tabors. The great ladies wave their mystic whips. All those who are gathered together in the town are drunk with wine and crowned with flowers. The tradespeople of the place walk joyously about, their heads scented with perfumed oils. All the children rejoice in honor of the goddess from the rising to the setting of the sun. The nights were as noisy as the days, and for a few hours they energetically made up for long months of torpor and monotonous existence. The god having re-entered the temple, and the pilgrims taking their departure, the regular routine was resumed and dragged on its tedious course, interrupted only by the weekly market. At an early hour on that day, the peasant folk came in from the surrounding country in an interminable stream and installed themselves in some open space, reserved from time immemorial for their use. The sheep, geese, goats, and large-horned cattle were grouped in the center, awaiting purchasers. Market gardeners, fishermen, fowlers and gazelle hunters, potters and small tradesmen squatted on the roadsides or against the houses and offered their wares for the inspection of their customers, heaped up in reed baskets or piled on low round tables. Vegetables and fruits, loaves or cakes baked during the night, meat either raw or cooked in various ways, stuffs, perfumes, ornaments, all the necessities and luxuries of daily life. It was a good opportunity for the workpeople as well as for the townsfolk to lay in a store of provisions at a cheaper rate than from the ordinary shops, and they took advantage of it, each according to his means. Business was mostly carried on by barter. The purchasers brought with them some product of their toil, a new tool, a pair of shoes, a reed mat, pots of unguents or cordials. Often, too, rows of cowries and a small box full of rings, each weighing a tabnu, made of copper, silver, or even gold, all destined to be bartered for such things as they needed. When it came to be a question of some large animal or of objects of considerable value, the discussions which arose were keen and stormy. It was necessary to be agreed not only on the amount, but as to the nature of the payment to be made, and to draw up a sort of invoice, or, in fact, an inventory, in which beds, sticks, honey, oil, pickaxes, and garments all figure as equivalents for a bull or a she-ass. Smaller retail bargains demanded not so many or such complicated calculations. Two townsfolk stop for a moment in front of a fellah who offers onions and corn in a basket. The first appears to possess no other circulating medium than two necklaces made of glass beads or many-colored enameled terracotta. The other flourishes about a circular fan with a wooden handle and one of those triangular contrivances used by cooks for blowing up the fire. "Here is a fine necklace that will suit you. It's just what you're wanting." While the other breaks in with, "Here is a fan and a ventilator." The fellah, however, does not let himself be disconcerted by this double attack, and proceeding methodically, he takes one of the necklaces to examine it at his leisure. "Give it to me to look at, that I may fix the price." The one asks too much, the other offers too little. After many concessions, they at last come to an agreement and settle on the number of onions or the quantity of grain that corresponds exactly with the value of the necklace or the fan. A little further on, a customer wishes to get some perfumes in exchange for a pair of sandals, and conscientiously praises his wares. "Here," says he, "is a strong pair of shoes." But the merchant has no wish to be shod just then, and demands a row of cowries for his little pots. "You have merely to take a few drops of this to see how delicious it is," he urges in a persuasive tone. A seated customer has 2 jars thrust under his nose by a woman. They probably contain some kind of unguent. "Here is something which smells good enough to tempt you." Behind this group, 2 men are discussing the relative merits of a bracelet and a bundle of fishhooks. A woman with a small box in her hand is having an argument with a merchant selling necklaces. Another woman seeks to obtain a reduction in the price of a fish which is being scraped in front of her. Exchanging commodities for metal necessitated 2 or 3 operations not required in ordinary barter. The rings or thin bent strips of metal that formed the tabnu and its multiples did not always contain the regulation amount of gold or silver and were often of light weight.
They had to be weighed at every fresh transaction in order to estimate their true value, and the interested parties never missed this excellent opportunity for a heated discussion. After having declared for a quarter of an hour that the scales were out of order, that the weighing had been carelessly performed, and that it should be done over again, they at last came to terms exhausted with wrangling, and then went their way, fairly satisfied with one another. It sometimes happened that a clever and unscrupulous dealer would alloy the rings and mix with the precious metal as much of a baser sort as would be possible without danger of detection. The honest merchant, who thought he was receiving in payment for some article, say 8 tabnu of fine gold, and who was handed 8 tabnu of some alloy resembling gold, but containing 1/3 of silver, lost in a single transaction, without suspecting it, almost 1/3 of his goods. The fear of such counterfeits instrumental in restraining the use of tabnu for a long time among the people, and restricted the buying and selling in the markets to exchange in natural products or manufactured objects. We must perhaps agree with Fraudlin Narment in his conclusion that the only kind of national metal of exchange in use in Egypt was a copper wire or plate bent thus, this being the sign invariably used in the hieroglyphics in writing the word tabnu. The present rural population of Egypt scarcely ever lives in isolated and scattered farms. They are almost all concentrated in hamlets and villages of considerable extent, divided into quarters, often at some distance from each other. The same state of things existed in ancient times, and those who would realize what a village in the past would like have only to visit any one of the modern market towns scattered at intervals along the valley of the Nile. A half-dozen fairly built houses, inhabited by the principal people of the place. Groups of brick or clay cottages thatched with dura stalks, so low that a man standing upright almost touches the roof with his head. Courtyards filled with tall, circular mud-built sheds, in which the corn and dura for the household is carefully stored, and wherever we turn, pigeons, ducks, geese, and animals, all living higgledy-piggledy with the family.
The majority of the peasantry were of the lower class, but they were not everywhere subjected to the same degree of servitude. The slaves, properly so called, came from other countries. They had been bought from foreign merchants, or they had been seized in a raid and had lost their liberty by the fortune of war. Their master removed them from place to place, sold them, used them as he pleased, pursued them if they succeeded in escaping, and had the right of recapturing them as soon as he received information of their whereabouts. They worked for him under his overseer's orders, receiving no regular wages, and with no hope of recovering their liberty. Many chose concubines from their own class, or intermarried with the natives and had families. At the end of 2 or 3 generations, their descendants became assimilated with the indigenous race and were neither more nor less than actual serfs attached to the soil, who were made over or exchanged with it. The landed proprietors, lords, kings, or gods accommodated this population either in the outbuildings belonging to the residences or in villages built for the purpose where everything belonged to them, both houses and people. The condition of the free agricultural laborer was in many respects analogous to that of the modern fellah. Some of them possessed no other property than a mud cabin, just large enough for a man and his wife, and hired themselves out by the day or the year as farm servants. Others were emboldened to lease land from the lord or from a soldier in the neighborhood. The most fortunate acquired some domain of which they were supposed to receive only the product, the freehold of the property remaining primarily in the hands of the pharaoh, and secondarily in that of lay or religious feudatories who held it of the sovereign. They could moreover bequeath, give, or sell these lands and buy fresh ones without any opposition. They paid, beside the capitation tax, a ground rent proportionate to the extent of their property and to the kind of land of which it consisted. It was not without reason that all the ancients attributed the invention of geometry to the Egyptians. The perpetual encroachments of the Nile and the displacements it occasioned, the facility with which it effaced the boundaries of the fields, and in one summer modified the whole face of a nome, had forced them from early times to measure with the greatest exactitude the ground to which they owed their sustenance.
The territory belonging to each town and nome was subjected to repeated surveys made and coordinated by the royal administration, thus enabling Pharaoh to know the exact area of his estates. The unit of measurement was the arura, that is to say, a square of 100 cubits comprising in round numbers 28 heirs. A considerable staff of scribes and surveyors was continually occupied in verifying the old measurements, or in making fresh ones and in recording in the state registers any changes which might have taken place. Each estate had its boundaries marked out by a line of stelae, which frequently bore the name of the tenant at the time and the date when the landmarks were last fixed. Once set up, the stelae received a name which gave it, as it were, a living and independent personality. Sometimes it recorded the nature of the soil, its situation, or some characteristic that made it remarkable. The Lake of the South, the Eastern Meadow, the Green Island, the Fisher's Pool, the Willow Plot, the Vineyard, the Vine Arbor, the Sycamore. Sometimes it bore the name of the first master or the pharaoh under whom it had been erected. The Nurse Fidau-Hetep, the Verger Cheops, the Meadow Didifri, the Abundant Sahuri, Khafre, great among the doubles. Once given, the name clung to it for centuries, and neither sales, nor redistributions, nor revolutions, nor changes of dynasty could cause it to be forgotten. The officers of the survey inscribed it in their books, together with the name of the proprietor, those of the owners of adjoining lands, and the area and nature of the ground which it contained. They noted down, to within a few cubits, the extent of the sand, marshland, pools, canals, groups of palms, gardens or orchards, vineyards, and cornfields which it contained. The cornland in its turn was divided into several classes, according to whether it was regularly inundated or situated above the highest rise of the water, and consequently dependent on a more or less costly system of artificial irrigation. All this was so much information of which the scribes took advantage in regulating the assessment of the land tax. Everything tends to make us believe that this tax represented 1/10 of the gross produce, but the amount of the latter varied. It depended on the annual rise of the Nile, and it followed the course of it almost with mathematical exactitude. If there was too much or too little water, it was immediately lessened and might even be reduced to nothing in extreme cases. The king and his capital, and the great lords and their fiefs had set up nilometers, by which, in the critical weeks, the height of the rising or subsiding flood was taken daily. Messengers carried the news of it over the country. The people, kept regularly informed of what was happening, soon knew what kind of season to expect, and they could calculate to within very little what they would have to pay. In theory, the collection of the tax was based on the actual amount of land covered by the water, and the produce of it was constantly varying. In practice, it was regulated by taking the average of preceding years and deducting from that a fixed sum which was never departed from except in extraordinary circumstances. The year would have to be a very bad one before the authorities would lower the ordinary rate. The state in ancient times was not more willing to deduct anything from its revenue than the modern state. The payment of taxes was exacted in wheat, durra, beans, and field produce, which were stored in the granaries of the nome. It would seem that the previous deduction of 1/10 of the gross amount of the harvest could not be a heavy burden, and that the wretched fellow ought to have been in a position at land at a fixed figure based on the average of good and bad harvests. It was not so, however, and the same writers who have given us such a lamentable picture of the condition of the workmen in the towns have painted for us in even darker colors the miseries which overwhelmed the country people. Dost thou not recall the picture of the farmer when the 10th of his grain is levied? Worms have destroyed half of the wheat, and the hippopotami have eaten the rest. There are swarms of rats in the fields, the grasshoppers alight there, the cattle devour, the little birds pilfer, and if the farmer lose sight for an instant of what remains upon the ground, it is carried off by robbers. The thongs, moreover, which bind the iron and the hoe, are worn out, and the team has died at the plow. It is then that the scribe steps out of the boat at the landing place to levy the tithe, and there come the keepers of the doors of the granary with cudgels, and the negroes with ribs of palm leaves, who come crying, "Come now, corn!" There is none, and they throw the cultivator full length upon the ground. Bound, dragged to the canal, they fling him in the head first. His wife is bound with him. His children are put in chains. The neighbors in the meantime leave him and fly to save their grain.
One might be tempted to declare that the picture is too dark a one to be true, did one not know from other sources of the brutal ways of filling the treasury, which Egypt has retained even to the present day. In the same way as in the town, the stick facilitated the operations of the tax collector in the country. It quickly opened the granaries of the rich, it revealed resources to the poor of which he had been ignorant, and it only failed in the case of those who had really nothing to give. Those who were insolvent were not let off even when they had been more than half killed. They and their families were sent to prison, and they had to work out in forced labor the amount which they had failed to pay in current merchandise. The collection of the taxes was usually terminated by a rapid revision of the survey. The scribe once more recorded the dimensions and character of the domain lands in order to determine afresh the amount of the tax which should be imposed upon them. It often happened, indeed, that, owing to some freak of the Nile, a tract of ground which had been fertile enough the preceding year would be buried under a gravel bed or transformed into a marsh. The owners who thus suffered were allowed an equivalent deduction. As for the farmers, no deductions of the burden were permitted in their case, but a tract equaling in value that of the part they had lost was granted to them out of the royal or seigneurial domain, and their property was thus made up to its original worth. What the collection of the taxes had begun was almost always brought to a climax by the corvées. However numerous the royal and seigneurial slaves might have been, they were insufficient for the cultivation of all the lands of the domains, and a part of Egypt must always have lain fallow had not the number of workers been augmented by the addition of those who were in the position of free men. This excess of cultivatable land was subdivided into portions of equal dimensions which were distributed among the inhabitants of neighboring villages by the officers of a regent nominated for that purpose. Those dispensed from agricultural service were the destitute, soldiers on service and their families, certain employees of the public works, and servitors of the temple. All other country folk without exception had to submit to it, and one or more portions were allotted to each according to his capabilities. Orders issued at fixed periods called them together, themselves, their servants, and their beasts of burden, to dig, sow, keep watch in the fields while the harvest was proceeding, to cut and carry the crops, the whole work being done at their own expense and to the detriment of their own interests. As a sort of indemnity, a few allotments were left uncultivated for their benefit. To these they sent their flocks after the subsidence of the inundation, for the pasturage on them was so rich that the sheep were doubly productive in wool and offspring. This was a mere apology for a wage. The forced labor for the irrigation brought them no compensation. The dikes that separate the basins in the network of canals for distributing the water and irrigating the land demand continual attention. Every year some need strengthening, others re-excavating or cleaning out. The men employed in this work spend whole days standing in the water, scraping up the mud with both hands in order to fill the baskets of plaited leaves, which boys and girls lift onto their heads and carry to the top of the bank. The semi-liquid contents ooze through the basket, trickle over their faces, and soon coat their bodies with a black shining mess, disgusting even to look at. Sheikhs preside over the work and urge it on with abuse and blows. When the gangs of workmen had toiled all day, with only an interval of 2 hours about noon for a siesta and a meager pittance of food, the poor wretches slept on the spot, in the open air, huddled one against another, and but ill protected by their rags from the chilly nights. The task was so hard a one that malefactors, bankrupts, and prisoners of war were condemned to it. It wore out so many hands that the free peasantry were scarcely ever exempt. Having returned to their homes, they were not called until the next year to any established or periodic corvée, but many an irregular one came and surprised them in the midst of their work and forced them to abandon all else to attend to the affairs of king or lord. Was a new chamber to be added to some neighboring temple?
or materials wanted to strengthen or rebuild some piece of wall which had been undermined by the inundation, orders were issued to the engineers to go and fetch a stated quantity of limestone or sandstone, and the peasants were commanded to assemble at the nearest quarry to cut the blocks from it, and if needful, to ship and convey them to their destination. Or perhaps the sovereign had caused a gigantic statue of himself to be carved, and a few hundred men were requisitioned to haul it to the place where he wished it to be set up. The undertaking ended in a gala, and doubtless in a distribution of food and drink. The unfortunate creatures who had gotten together to execute the work could not always have felt fitly compensated for the precious time they had lost by one day of drunkenness and rejoicing. We may ask if all these corvées were equally legal. Even if some of them were illegal, the peasant on whom they fell could not have found the means to escape from them, nor could he have demanded legal reparation for the injury which they caused him. Justice in Egypt and in the whole Oriental world necessarily emanates from political authority, and has only one branch of the administration amongst others, in the hands of the Lord and his representatives. Professional magistrates were unknown, men brought up to the study of law, whose duty it was to ensure its observance apart from any other calling. But the same men who commanded armies, offered sacrifices, and assessed and received taxes, investigated the disputes of ordinary citizens, or settled the differences which arose between them and the representatives of the lords or of the pharaoh. In every town and village, those who held by birth or favor the position of governor were in ex officio invested with the right of administering justice. For a certain days of the month, they sat at the gate of the town or of the building which served as their residence, and all those in the town or neighborhood possessed of any title, position, or property, the superior priesthood of the temples, scribes who had advanced or grown old in office, those in command of the militia or the police, the heads of divisions or corporations, the combitiu, the people of the angle, might, if they thought it fit, take their place beside them and help them to decide ordinary lawsuits. The police were mostly recruited from foreigners and Negroes or Bedouin belonging to the Nubian tribe of the Maziu. The litigants appeared at the tribunal and waited under the superintendence of the police until their turn came to speak. The majority of the questions were decided in a few minutes by a judgment by which there was no appeal. Only the more serious cases necessitated a cross-examination and prolonged discussion. All else was carried on before this patriarchal jury as in our own courts of justice, except that the inevitable stick too often elucidated the truth and cut short discussions. The depositions of the witnesses, the speeches on both sides, the examination of the documents could not proceed without the frequent taking of oaths by the life of the king or by the favor of the gods, in which the truth often suffered severely. Penalties were varied somewhat: the bastinado, imprisonment, additional days for the corvée, and for grave offenses, forced labor in the Ethiopian mines, the loss of nose and ears, and finally, death by strangulation, by beheading, by impalement, and at the stake.
Criminals of high rank obtained permission to carry out on themselves the sentence passed upon them, and thus avoided by suicide the shame of public execution. Before tribunals thus constituted, the fellah who came to appeal against the exactions of which he was the victim had little chance of obtaining a hearing. Had not the scribe who had overtaxed him, or who had imposed a fresh corvée upon him, the right to appear among the judges to whom he had addressed himself? Nothing, indeed, prevented him from appealing from the latter to his feudal lord, and from him to Pharaoh. But such an appeal would be for him a mere delusion. When he had left his village and presented his petition, he had many delays to encounter before a solution could be arrived at. And if the adverse party were at all in favor at court, or could command any influence, the sovereign decision would confirm, even if it did not aggravate, the sentence of the previous judges. In the meantime, the peasant's land remained uncultivated. His wife and children bewailed their wretchedness, and the last resources of the family were consumed in proceedings and delays. It would have been better for him, at the outset, to have made up his mind to submit without resistance to a fate from which he could not escape. In spite of taxes, requisitions, and forced labor, the Fellaim came off fairly well when the chief to whom they belonged proved a kind master and did not add the exactions of his own personal caprice to those of the state. The inscriptions which princes caused to be devoted to their own glorification are so many enthusiastic panegyrics dealing only with their uprightness and kindness toward the poor and lowly. Every one of them represents himself as faultless. The staff of support to the aged, the foster father of the children, the counselor of the unfortunate, the refuge in which those who suffer from the cold in Thebes may warm themselves, the bread of the afflicted which never failed in the city of the south. Their solicitude embraced everybody and everything. I have caused no child of tender age to mourn. I have despoiled no widow. I have driven away no tiller of the soil. I have taken no workmen away from their foremen for the public works. None have been unfortunate about me, nor starving in my time. When years of scarcity arose, I had cultivated all the lands of the nome of the gazelle to its northern and southern boundaries, causing its inhabitants to live and creating provisions. None who were hungry were found there, for I gave to the widow as well as to the woman who had a husband, and I made no distinction between high and low in all that I gave. If, on the contrary, there were high Niles, the possessors of lands became rich in all things, for I did not raise the rate of the tax upon the fields. The canals engrossed all the prince's attention. He cleaned them out, enlarged them, and dug fresh ones, which were the means of bringing fertility and plenty into the most remote corners of his property. His serfs had a constant supply of clean water at their door, and were no longer content with such food as Dura. They ate wheaten bread daily. His vigilance and severity were such that the brigands dared no longer appear within reach of his arm, and his soldiers kept strict discipline. When night fell, whoever soiled by the roadside blessed me, and was in safety as a man in his own house. The fear of my police protected him. The cattle remained in the fields as in the stable. The thief was as the abomination of the god, and he no more fell upon the vassal, so that the latter no more complained, but paid exactly the dues of his domain, for love of his master, who had procured for him this freedom from care. This theme might be pursued at length, for the composers of epitaphs varied it with remarkable cleverness and versatility of imagination. The very zeal which they display in describing the Lord's virtues betrays how precarious was the condition of his subjects. There was nothing to hinder the unjust prince or the prevaricating officer from ruining and ill-treating as he chose the people who were under his authority. He had only to give an order, and the corvée fell upon the proprietors of a village, carried off their slaves, and obliged them to leave their lands uncultivated. Should they declare that they were incapable of paying the contributions laid on them, the prison opened for them and their families. If a dike was cut, or the course of a channel altered, the nome was deprived of water. Prompt and inevitable ruin came upon the unfortunate inhabitants, and their property, confiscated by the treasury in payment of the tax, passed for a small consideration into the hands of the scribe or of the dishonest administrator.
2 or 3 years of neglect were almost enough to destroy a system of irrigation. The canals became filled with mud, the banks crumbled, the inundation either failed to reach the ground or spread over it too quickly and lay upon it too long. Famine soon followed with its attendant sicknesses. Men and animals died by the hundred, and it was the work of almost a whole generation to restore prosperity to the district.
The lot of the fella of old was, as we have seen, as hard as that of the fella of today. He himself felt the bitterness of it and complained at times, or rather the scribes complained for him, when with selfish complacency they contrasted their calling with his. He had to toil the whole year round, digging, sowing, working the shadoof from morning to night for weeks, hastening at the first requisition to the corvée, paying a heavy and cruel tax, all without even the certainty of enjoying what remained to him in peace or of seeing his wife and children profit by it. So great, however, was the elasticity of his temperament that his misery was not sufficient to depress him. Those monuments upon which his life is portrayed in all its minutiae represent him as animated with inexhaustible cheerfulness. The summer months ended, the ground again became visible, the river retired into its bed, the time of sowing was at hand. The peasant takes his team and implements with him and goes off to the fields. In many places, the soil, softened by the water, offers no resistance, and the hoe easily turns it up. Elsewhere it is hard and only yields to the plow. While one of the farm servants, almost bent double, leans his whole weight on the handles to force the plowshare deep into the soil. His comrade drives the oxen and encourages them by his songs. These are only 2 or 3 short sentences, set to an unvarying chant, and with the time beaten on the back of the nearest animal. Now and again he turns around towards his comrade and encourages him, "Lean hard! Hold fast!" The sower follows behind and throws handfuls of grain into the furrow. A flock of sheep or goats brings up the rear, and as they walk they tread the seed into the ground. The herdsmen crack their whips and sing some country song at the top of their voices, based on the complaint of some fella seized by the corvée to clean out a canal. The digger is in the water with the fish. He talks to the Silaris and exchanges greetings with the Oxyrhynchus. "West! Your digger is a digger from the west!" All this takes place under the vigilant eye of his master. As soon as his attention is relaxed, the work slackens, quarrels arise, and the spirit of idleness and theft gain the ascendancy. 2 men have unharnessed their team. One of them quickly milks one of the cows. The other holds the animal and impatiently awaits his turn. "Be quick, while the farmer is not there!" They run the risk of a beating for a potful of milk. Weeks pass. The corn has ripened. The harvest begins. The fellahin, armed with a short sickle, cut, or rather saw, the stalks, a handful at a time. As they advance in line, a flute player plays them captivating tunes. A man joins in with his voice, marking the rhythm by clapping his hands. The foreman throwing in now and then a few words of exhortation. "What that among you when the season is over can say, 'It is I who say it, to thee and to my comrades, you are all of you but idlers'? Who among you can say, 'An active lad for the job am I'?" A servant moves among the gang with a tall jar of beer, offering it to those who wish for it. "Is it not good?" said he. And the one who drinks answers politely, "'Tis true, the master's beer is better than a cake of durra." The sheaves once bound are carried to the singing of fresh songs addressed to the donkeys who bear them. "Those who quit the ranks will be tied. Those who roll on the ground will be beaten. Jeho, then!" And thus threatened, the ass trots forward. Even when a tragic element enters the scene and the bastinado is represented, the sculptor, catching the bantering spirit of the people among whom he lives, manages to insinuate a vein of comedy. A peasant, summarily condemned for some misdeed, lies flat upon the ground with bared back.
2 friends take hold of his arms and 2 others his legs to keep him in the proper position. His wife or his son intercedes for him to the man with the stick. "For mercy's sake, strike on the ground!" And as a fact, the bastonada was commonly rather a mere form of chastisement than an actual punishment. The blows dealt with apparent ferocity, missed their aim, and fell upon the earth. The culprit howled loudly, but was let off with only a few bruises. An Arab writer of the Middle Ages remarks, not without irony, that the Egyptians were perhaps the only people in the world who never kept any stores of provisions by them, but each went to the market daily to buy the pittance for his family. The improvidence which he laments over in his contemporaries had been handed down from their most remote ancestors. Workmen, fellahin, employees, small townsfolk, all lived from hand to mouth in the Egypt of the pharaohs. Pay days were almost everywhere days of rejoicing and extra eating. No one spared either the grain, oil, or beer of the treasury, and copious feasting continued unsparingly as long as anything was left of their wages. As their resources were almost always exhausted before the day of distribution once more came around, beggary succeeded to fullness of living, and a part of the population was literally starving for several days. This almost constant alternation of abundance and dearth had a reactionary influence on daily work. There were scarcely any seigneurial workshops or undertakings which did not come to a standstill every month on account of the exhaustion of the workmen, and help had to be provided for the starving in order to avoid popular seditions. Their improvidence, like their cheerfulness, was perhaps an innate trait in the national character. It was certainly fostered and developed by the system of government adopted by Egypt from the earliest times. What incentive was there for a man of the people to calculate his resources and to lay up for the future when he knew that his wife, his children, his cattle, his goods, all that belonged to him and himself to boot, might be carried off at any moment without him having the right or the power to resent it? He was born, he lived, and he died in the possession of a master. The lands or houses that his father had left him were merely on suffrage, and he enjoyed them only by permission of his lord. Those which he acquired by his own labor went to swell his master's domain. If he married and had sons, they were but servants for the master from the moment they were brought into the world. Whatever he might enjoy today, would his master allow him possession of it tomorrow? Even life in the world beyond did not offer him much more security or liberty. He only entered it in his master's service and to do his bidding. He existed in it on tolerance, as he had lived upon this earth, and he found there no rest or freedom unless he provided himself abundantly with respondents and charmed statuettes. Therefore he concentrated his mind and energies on the present moment to make the most of it as almost the only thing which belonged to him. He left to his master the task of anticipating and providing for the future. In truth, his masters were often changed, now the lord of one town, now that of another, now a pharaoh of the Memphite or Theban dynasties, now a stranger installed by chance upon the throne of Horus. The people never changed. The burden which crushed them never lightened, and whatever hand happened to hold the stick, it never fell less heavily on their backs.